We have a weird homicide.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate, who starred in Valley of the Dolls, was 8 months pregnant and was found in a bikini-type nightgown with a rope around her neck attached to the body of a man.
2 bodies inside, 2 bodies outside.
Among the other victims were Hollywood hairstylist Jay Sebring and coffee heiress Abigail Folger.
The word pig had been scrawled in blood on the door of the Bel Air mansion, where actress Sharon Tate and 4 others were slain.
A wandering band of members of a so-called religious cult, with a leader they called Jesus, has had 3 of its followers arrested in the investigation of the murder of Sharon Tate and 6 others. Those arrested are 2 women and 1 man, and the Los Angeles police said they would ask murder indictments against several others. 5 women are being held as material witnesses.
Or am I all things to all people in all ways? Am I their death if they seek it too closely? Am I their judgments if they find harshness within themselves?
Do you know if any of your children have followed in your footsteps?
To all my children. And anybody ever seen me is following in my footsteps. How else could they do anything else? It's a brand new step. Never been done. It's history. Every step I take now is history. And I'm carrying 900 million people in my mind. True, I know my mind. And I trust the very same person that you do. And the very same person that you do. I trust the only person left to trust. Me.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came.
And for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order.
New world order.
You saw?
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the law. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. Ah! He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
We can keep it. Period. They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 026, Charles Manson and the Myth of Helter Skelter. Our featured guest tonight in the Midnight Hour is author-filmmaker Nikolas Schreck, the author of The Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman. A brief little cleaning of the castle first. Please allow us to say that we're on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. That's at Midnight Rider News Show. Our Twitter is at MWN_ST Patrick. Our LinkedIn is at ST Patrick. And our email is midnightridernews@gmail.com. And we'll be right back with Nikolas Schreck. From the American Revolution to 9/11, from the writing of the unseen hand to his time spent with William Cooper, Behold a Pale Horse, conspiracy legend Ralph Epperson joined the Midnight Rider News Show to discuss what it was like to do conspiratorial research old school.
Hi, this is Ralph Epperson, author of The Unseen Hand. If you want to know more about the conspiratorial view of American history and the real story of what happened to the outlaw Jesse James, listen to episode 15 of the Midnight Rider News Show today.
We have a weird homicide.
Human massacre. 5 were killed.
When you kill somebody, you're killing yourself. The incredible brutality of these savage, nightmarish murders.
Here was Charlie's game.
I walk and live in murder all my life.
Charles Manson converted intelligent, middle-class kids into putty-like zombies.
The jury could only come to one verdict, guilty.
To explain Manson, it could not be done in words.
The most famous murder in the history of Los Angeles.
Sharon Tate was a young actress, stunning even by movie star standards.
Sharon Tate. She's today's kind of girl.
3 friends were staying with her that night. The windows were open. A cool breeze was blowing.
It's simply going to be a quiet, comfortable night. And of course, it turned out not to be.
Charles Manson was a rock star wannabe and a madman.
He could literally get his followers to kill for him.
Everyone wondered, how did he turn these all-American women into monsters?
I knew that people would die. I knew that there would be killing.
He controlled them, and they did what he wanted.
They were so young.
And what he wanted was murder. Brutal murder.
If it don't get done, then I'll move on it. And that's the last thing in the world you want me to do.
You're about to see what evil looks like in the face of Charles Manson.
Singer-songwriter, author, and filmmaker Nikolas Schreck is the pioneer that founded the musical ensemble Radio Werewolf. Schreck produced the first album of actor Sir Christopher Lee, who many of you may know from his appearances in the Hammer horror films. He's the author of the Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman, and he's the director of the 1989 documentary Charles Manson Superstar. The documentary featured an interview with Charles Manson, which, Schreck had gained Manson's confidence as much as anyone can after years of correspondence, so it's a very good documentary to watch. Schreck may know the truth behind the Manson story and the Manson psyche more than anyone. Now, he doesn't do many interviews at all. Most mainstream journalists believe the Vincent Bugliosi helter-skelter myth, a myth which, with many, cannot be fought. So, however, he did agree to be on with us tonight because he knows that you, our most humble and loyal audience, are open-minded seekers of historical truths. Now, that's our mission, and that's what we will continue to do tonight. He's joining us live from Berlin, Germany, to tell us how and why Charles Manson did not order the Tate-Labianca murders of 1969. He will also tell us what happened, but more importantly, he'll tell us why it happened. Nikolas Schreck, welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. How are you this evening?
I'm fine and happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Nicholas, it's hard to believe it's been 48 years since the murders first hit the headlines and almost instantly became an American myth in so many ways. How did you first get interested in this story?
Well, that in itself is it goes back 48 years. I'll try to say it in the most condensed way possible. In 1969, when the murders occurred, I was in Europe, actually, and I was in Paris right before they happened, and I saw the film that is called in America The Fearless Vampire Killers. And it's known in Europe as The Dance of the Vampires. I saw this at a theater in Paris, and as your listeners may or may not know, the film starred Sharon Tate, who was murdered that very year. And Roman Polanski directed it, and that was actually, as it turned out, a film that created part of the genesis of what led to the murders. Polanski meeting Sharon Tate and various people in the drug underworld that Polanski knew, that then moved with him to Los Angeles, actually sort of set the bloody ball rolling that led to the murder. So I saw that film and was strangely fascinated by it. I've discussed this before, so I won't go into great detail about it. But the interesting thing about it, the film captivated me for some reason. I was a child then, and one of the interesting things about it, another actor in the film, a German-English actor named Ferdinand Main, many years later was who gave me one of the first major breaks in understanding what the case was all about, primarily in that he was the first one who clearly and uncategorically stated to me that he had no doubt that the killers in the so-called Manson murders or Tate-Labianca murders knew the victims, and he basically stated that that was an open secret in Hollywood, and that almost everyone involved in the small circle of people who knew these individuals was aware of that. And that was a major break in my research into the case. So even all those years back, I think it's interesting that the first thing that even got me thinking about Polanski and Tate was this particular horror comedy called The Dance of the Vampires, which I saw in Paris. So I don't know why it captivated me, but it did. And it stuck with me for some reason. And in retrospect, I think it was some kind of premonition, because even though it's a very light-hearted film, something about it seemed uncanny or disturbing. And I believe it was a foreshadowing of what would later be my involvement in this case. In 1970, I wasn't really aware, and I don't recall being aware of any knowledge of the murders themselves when they occurred, because I was in Europe when that happened, and it didn't get covered to the same extent there. So I don't really remember that. But in 1970, when the Manson and his 3 co-defendants were on trial, that was all over U.S. television and the news constantly. And in the summer of 1970, I was in New England and became captivated with the way that the media was covering it, particularly because at that time in New England, I was looking very much into the witchcraft trials and the Salem witch trial and the Salem witch hunt, which is sort of the epitome of American moral hysteria and mass panic. And even as a young child, I saw parallels between the Salem witch trial and the way that the media was treating the Charles Manson and co-defendants trial, in that they were the sensational tales of occultism and Satanism and the almost religious level of scapegoating of these people, even as a child, seemed to me to be a parallel to the Salem witch trials. So I didn't study it in any great detail, but I was captivated by it, and particularly from the beginning, I noticed, Charles Manson is being presented as a delusional madman, but the very few things that ever seeped out at that time, which wasn't much, seemed to me to make sense. And I should also point out, at that time in Boston, where I was when that was happening, and in New England, the hippie community there, this has been forgotten, pretty much considered that Manson had been framed to tar or to destroy the reputation of the counterculture and of the peace movement. So that was a very common idea, and I encountered in head shops in Boston posters that said Free Manson and buttons that said Free Manson. So from the beginning, I had a positive feeling about him, or a more sympathetic feeling about him, probably than many other Americans did at the time, though it was fairly common in the counterculture community. So that was my initial reaction to the actual events that occurred. In 1975, when Lynette Fromme made her sort of semi-attempted assassination activity, you could almost call it, because it really didn't seem to be a serious assassination attempt. In any case, when she was arrested for attempted assassination of President Gerald R. Ford, that reawakened my attention after several years in the case, and in Manson particularly, in his philosophy. And Lynette Fromme spoke a great deal about her ecological beliefs, her anti-pollution beliefs, really ideology that has now become fairly common, but was then considered radical, about the necessity of stopping fossil fuel, of stopping corporate destruction of the ecology. So she fascinated me because she seemed cogent and lucid and not at all like the demented maniac that the mass media was presenting her as. So then, in 1975, when I was a teenager, I began looking into, what are the actual beliefs of these people? And I found that even from what very little was available at the time, it really didn't jibe with what the mass media and the trial had presented, and particularly the book Helter Skelter, which is unfortunately the source of what most of the public knows about this case. It didn't seem to make sense, because what I was looking at as far as direct statements from these people were not the demented ideology of creating a race war or killing people for no particular reason. So it just didn't make sense to me, though I really had no clear idea what the crime was about at the time. That made me doubt it strongly, if you follow me so far.
Oh, absolutely. So I'd like to hit the scene on both coasts at this time, if you don't mind. How did Timothy Leary figure into your research? And then I'd like to know about Topanga Canyon, because it seems like the West Coast rock scene had sort of moved south from San Francisco to Topanga. So how did that rock and roll culture of Topanga Canyon affect Manson and those who followed him?
Right. It's deeper than that even, but that, of course, is true. And Topanga Canyon in particular is not really looked at as closely as it should be. The connection between the Manson commune or Manson circle, which is what I think is a more accurate way of describing them, and the Manson family, which is, I'll explain later, was really a created label that they themselves never used for themselves at the time. But you did want me to mention the Timothy Leary connection before we got to the rock and roll enmeshment. So I just wanted to follow up on that, and then we can get into Topanga Canyon. After this fascination with Squeaky Fromme, and which got me looking into it in 1975, as I've mentioned elsewhere, but you did particularly want to get into that, and I think it's important, I encountered Timothy Leary at the Los Angeles Book Fair in 1976. In the 60s, he was the main proponent of LSD as a spiritual awakening force, and his biography, which I brought to be signed for me to this LA Book Fair, was called High Priest. So he was at least the proponent of LSD in the 60s and in the counterculture that the mass media focused on the most, and he became almost synonymous with spreading the idea that LSD was an awakening agent and something of great spiritual value. And he was called by Richard Nixon the most dangerous man in America. He was eventually put on trial. He also was deeply involved in the drug-dealing underworld as well. So Timothy Leary was, a crucial person in the counterculture of the American 60s and worldwide. So he had been let out of prison in 1976, just then, and I met him at the LA Book Fair and spoke to him primarily because I had read that he had recently been released from Folsom Prison and had served time right next to Charles Manson. And I asked him about that. And at that time, I really only knew about the case, what was available in the media. He gave me a certain look and a smile that suggested something much deeper than I could convey over the radio. But he said, in a way that really struck me, there is so much more to this case than anyone can ever imagine. And he spoke about how the Charles Manson that he heard, he never met him, but he heard him next door. They spoke to each other. They were placed in a cell with each other, next to each other in Folsom Prison, was nothing like the bloodthirsty monster that had been presented in the mass media. So that really intrigued me, because really that's the first time I'd heard anyone say anything sympathetic about him in years, and it opened a door to my looking into, well, what does he mean? There's much more to this case than has ever been known, because at the time, most people assumed that Bugliosi's Helter Skelter book had pretty much explained exactly what the case was about, and the TV movie that was made that year, 1976, for those who couldn't read, put it into the minds of the mass public as well. So that really intrigued me. The interesting thing about Leary is he had snitched on many of his drug dealer associates, and that's how he got out of prison. He had turned state's evidence against many of his former associates, which pretty much means you're a marked man in the underworld. And I suspect he was placed near Manson to try to get some kind of information from him as well. And in later years, I found out that Manson absolutely detested Timothy Leary. And in the early 80s, I got to know Leary slightly, but that's a whole other story. But it sort of confirmed my beliefs that he was, an extremely unethical person who was up to much more than we could imagine as well. But I think it's interesting that he's who opened the door to my looking into this. So then, if you have any questions about that, we can cover it. But
sure, I do have one actually. There have been many comments made by some authors that Leary was actively involved with either the CIA or the FBI, and in more ways than just drug experimentation. And I want to ask you if you believe that was the case.
Well, yes, I absolutely believe it, and I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to prove it. From my encounter with him, I really do believe he had some kind of intelligence agency background. A few simple things we can get into without digressing away from the Manson case, which is the central focus, but in a more overarching way, the real story we're talking about is what was the counterculture really, and how did the mass media report it, and how did its changing of the mass media coalesce with the way the intelligence agencies shifted public opinion at the time. So that's the larger story here, so I think it's significant. I personally believe there's plenty of reason to believe that Leary was working on the margins of the CIA. I don't think he was employed by them, but I think he was a sympathetic agent to them from many things I encountered and many things I've encountered in my research. For one thing, his employer at Harvard, which, that's no secret, Harvard and Yale have always been the main recruiting center in those days of the intelligence community, as they euphemistically call themselves. His employer at Harvard was definitely a CIA agent, and I'm pretty certain that the early LSD experiments Leary was doing with psilocybin, mescaline, and LSD at Harvard were sponsored, and that he shared the research with the CIA, which I'm not trying to make that sound sinister, because at that time, most of American academia was working closely with the intelligence agencies. And I'm not suggesting it like in some kind of Illuminati, ridiculous sensationalist theory. It's just a fact that the science departments of United States universities were working very closely with the Pentagon and with the CIA, because it was the Cold War, and there was a lot of research going on in academia that was useful to intelligence and military application. So I'm certain that Leary was on the margins of it, and I think he was deeply involved with some sort of CIA activity. But I think it would be speculation and also too complicated to get into here. But that's my personal belief from knowing him. I think he was a completely unethical person who would have gone whichever way he was being paid.
I think that's an important point to make, and I'm really glad you made it, Nikolas. While there's a counterculture here, what we now know is that the lines between the counterculture and the national security complex were blurred at best. Now, when a countercultural movement begins questioning its own leader, so to speak, and then you throw in copious amounts of LSD, it's not a surprise that confusion and paranoia reigned supreme in 1969.
Well, I think what we're looking at, if we look at the bigger story, that the Charles Manson case is perhaps just the most dramatic and sensationally covered of the various facets of what the 1960s were really about, and that is really what this story actually comes down to. Is the interface between, I want to put this very carefully, because again, I'm not talking about some kind of wild conspiracy theory. I'm talking about the normal activities of intelligence and law enforcement and the way that they interconnect with the criminal underworld. That's really what happened in the Manson case, and that's what Leary was involved in. And I think it all has a lot to do with the outlawing of LSD in 1966, which, as I've said before, and I make it clear in my book, The Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman, the Manson crimes and several lesser-known crimes that occurred in the counterculture hippie milieu in the 60s should best be compared to the crime wave that occurred during Prohibition. And I don't think people really get this connection, so I want to try to explain that, is that when the United States government made the lunatic decision during Prohibition to ban alcohol, of course, it did not lead to an upsurge in morality. What it did was give organized crime a huge industry, which was bootlegging and the distribution of illegal alcohol. And that led to, all kinds of mayhem, as we know. That's what created the crime wave of the 1930s. The same thing happened in the 60s when the federal government banned research and use of psychedelics and turned usage of them into a major felony. The mafia and various other organized crime factions moved in to sweep up the profits. And that is what led to the Manson murders, basically, was competition between drug dealers, just exactly as what would have happened in Chicago during the 1930s between various gangs vying for control of bootlegging, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Let's turn back to Topanga Canyon and the rise of the rock culture of the late 60s. Right. Now, I've always believed that culture and environment tell us much about a story, and especially about this story. So what was it about the Topanga Canyon scene that affected Manson and his community so heavily?
Right. Well, I should say this as a kind of proviso to that, is my primary interest at first when I contacted Manson in 1985. I'm a musician, and my primary interest in him was as a musician. And our first contact was pretty much about music and an effort that I made to make a live recording of him performing his music in San Quentin prison, which, as I've recently discussed with another interviewer, was basically that turned into the film Charles Manson Superstar, because the prison authorities wouldn't allow him to use a guitar, saying that it could be used as a weapon. So instead, we did an interview at the last minute, which basically became the core of my 1989 documentary, Charles Manson Superstar. So what you say about culture being important, I think it's extremely crucial to this case and to understanding what this is all about. In fact, it's the essential factor is Manson's music. Maybe before I get into the specifics of what you're asking about Topanga Canyon, if I were to ask you, what is the public myth of Charles Manson's connection to music? I think, like most people, the first thing that comes to mind, the myth of Manson as a musician, is that he was a talentless nobody, desperate for attention from the music industry, who was considered to be talentless by everyone he encountered, who was spurned, and who then jealously sought revenge on the music industry that had spurned his talent out of his megalomaniac hatred of society. That's basically the idea that is pushed by the mass media.
Right.
And if you look at most interviews with the aging rock and roll music figures from that time who encountered him, most of them pretty much pushed that party line, that he was a talentless musician and that, the murders must have some way been motivated by his hatred of the music industry that had spurned him. Well, that's not even remotely true. Now, as far as his talent, that's a subjective matter, whether you like his music or don't like his music. The fact is, and here I think it's important to trace this whole development and see how his music is intrinsically connected to the crimes that occurred later, and vice versa, how really they're all part of one continuum. When he was in prison in Terminal Island in 1960, a little bit before that, he had encountered, many musicians in prison, and he'd been working on guitar playing in several prison bands. But through creepy Alvin Karpis, who a name may be forgotten these days, but once creepy Alvin Karpis was public enemy number one during the 1930s crime spree. He was a figure in the Ma Barker gang and a legendary figure in United States crime history. He was actually personally arrested by J. Edgar Hoover. Well, Alvin Creepy Karpis was one of the first people who actually saw Manson's talent in prison when he was just an unknown fellow con. He taught him some steel guitar rubs, and Manson has spoken of him as a kind of mentor. Creepy Alvin Karpis, though, was also deeply connected to the underworld and to the mafia, and as most people who know about prison culture know, the underworld and organized crime is very active within prison. So what's important to know about this is that a lot of people may be aware of Karpis being a sort of musical mentor to Manson and teaching him some guitar methods and techniques. But what's more important to the whole case is that Karpis gave some references for Manson, because he was going to be paroled shortly thereafter, to underworld figures who ran nightclubs and who were involved in the music industry. So as happens in prison, there's always a kind of favor given, but there's a favor owed, if you follow what I'm saying. So Karpis gave Manson references to other music people outside so that when he got out, he could look for work. Another underworld figure Manson encountered in prison was Frankie Carbo, who was also a legendary underworld figure at that time, and he was known as Mr. Gray. You couldn't even speak about Frankie Carbo in a phone conversation because the FBI listening in would know who you were talking about. So he was spoken of as Mr. Gray. But he fixed major boxing fights. He was basically the lord of illegal gambling of Las Vegas. He probably fixed the fight that made Muhammad Ali or then Cassius Clay a champion. He was an extremely powerful underworld figure. Manson met him, and he too, through the Karpis connection, also gave references to Manson in the outer world, so that when he got out of prison, he could apply for work at various nightclubs. So that's a very important thing that ties in later to the crimes. Another guy that Manson encountered in prison named Philip Kaufman, who was a drug dealer, which is an important factor to keep in mind because this whole case is all about drug dealing. It's basically what it all comes down to. Phil Kaufman gave references to Manson as well in prison to go to a guy at Universal Studios called Gary Stromberg. And Gary Stromberg, by his own admission, had been sending LSD in letters, in other words, writing letters that were dipped in liquid LSD to the prison so that the prisoners could take acid in prison. And that was one of the ways that Manson got introduced to the world that was outside of drug dealing. He had formerly been a petty thief, a pimp, an auto ring operator, basically a petty thief, though, and a pimp. And it was through Kaufman and other people he encountered that he started to see the new crime industry that was worth getting into was drug dealing. And Haight-Ashbury was happening right outside, as he was getting out of prison. So these are very important connections to keep in mind, is that even his musical career, such as it was, these references he got were underworld figures giving him connections that were also tied to the underworld. And as far as the idea of Manson being this hapless failure as a musician, let's keep this in mind to set it in its correct context. Immediately after he gets out of prison in March of 1967, he has these connections with mafia nightclubs where he auditions in San Francisco. He's given this reference to Gary Stromberg, who was an up-and-coming music publicity director and for a while a producer at Uni Records, which was the new record company from Universal Studios, which was at the time the most powerful entertainment conglomerate in Los Angeles. So he had very good references, and he went to Stromberg in September of 1967, and through a guy named Russ Regan, who was the head of Uni Records, was given money to record immediately a demo tape at Gold Star Studios, which people who know something about the history of popular music would know Gold Star Studios is a legendary recording studio where the Beach Boys, Mamas and the Papas, Phil Spector, and countless other acts of the time recorded some of the most well-known masterpieces and hit songs of the 60s. So that is not somebody who was an undistinguished musician. He was immediately given an opportunity to record a demo tape at Gold Star Studios pretty much as soon as he got out of prison. So this connection didn't pan out for various other reasons, which I get into in my book. But he then moved to Topanga Canyon, Manson and a small circle of women that were forming around him at that time. Topanga Canyon is a very isolated and remote area in sort of near Malibu, and a very rural oasis in the urban decadence of Los Angeles. And in Topanga Canyon at that time, in a place called the Snake Pit, hippies and counterculture people that were sick of the urban environment were moving out there to live in nature to the degree that one can in the midst of Los Angeles. But it's a very beautiful rural area, like an island of peace in the midst of the noise of Los Angeles. So Manson was drawn there, and there was a club there that was called the Topanga Corral. And there, the entire elite of the music industry went there to, so to speak, literally let their hair down. And Manson actually performed there with a short-lived band that he formed called the Milky Way. And that was where he encountered Bobby Beausoleil in the process of looking for musicians to play with this very short-lived band of his, which most people don't remember. But that means that it was, again, through his musical career, forming a band, that he met Bobby Beausoleil. Now, I don't know if your listeners are aware of the entire complex saga, but Beausoleil committed the first murder, which is in the legend considered to be the first of these Manson murders, which I think is a misnomer. So the important thing is to see, in his musical career, it's what leads him to encounter each member along the way of the dramatis personae that ended up being involved in the murders, if you follow that. So Bobby Beausoleil was friends with Gary Hinman, who was a small-time drug dealer and guitar teacher and musician in that area. And Gary Hinman was, as you may know, one of the first people to be murdered during this very complicated and still mysterious crime spree that occurred 2 years later. But he was a friend of Manson and Bobby Beausoleil, and they knew each other through their mutual musical interests. So now, in the Topanga Canyon Corral, Manson encountered pretty much the entire cream of the crop of the LA rock industry. And, he's told me many, many anecdotes about how well he knew all these people. Everyone, he had met there, everyone from Linda Ronstadt, Buffalo Springfield, Spirit, many other major bands of the time. So he was a figure on the rock and roll scene, known to everybody, even in 1967 when he'd just been released from prison. And then they remained in Topanga Canyon on and off deeply into 1968 and 69, returning to it on and off. The major connection that was next needed, and again it ties music to the murders, was that Manson met Dennis Wilson, who was then the drummer of the Beach Boys, which at that time was one of the hugest rock bands in the world, second perhaps only to the Beatles at that time, and also in terms of cultural impact, they influenced the Beatles influenced them. But the very important fact to bring up there is, the legend that Manson was supposedly obsessed with the Beatles and that the murders were inspired by secret messages that he supposedly contrived from listening to the White Album, right?
Right, the Helter Skelter reference.
Well, you have to keep in mind why that's this whole idea that he was a starstruck nobody who only wished he could communicate with the Beatles. Dennis Wilson and all of the Beach Boys, who Manson got to know fairly well, and so did many of his other associates, including the girls, they knew the Beatles very well. So, he was moving in circles with people who knew the Beatles quite well. And he never was a great admirer of the Beatles. The young people around him were, but he wasn't. But the fact is, if he wanted to talk to the Beatles, Paul McCartney had visited Brian Wilson, who Manson knew, in that period. And in a recording studio in Brian Wilson's home, where Manson actually recorded the demo for another album, Paul McCartney had been there. So he was only ever one phone call away from the Beatles, and he knew many people who were befriended with them. So I think that's an important point to make clear. Now, the significance of Dennis Wilson is often overshadowed. It's sort of treated like a novelty, that this wholesome and good-natured and most cheerful of the major rock bands of the 60s would have been involved in the supposedly sinister Manson family. But the fact is, Dennis Wilson was deeply searching for a spiritual mentor. He had recently gone with the Beatles to India to meet the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, along with Mia Farrow and many other Hollywood and music industry figures. And the whole Wilson family were looking for spiritual answers. So there was really nothing strange about Dennis Wilson being intrigued with Manson's philosophy and spiritual practices. And what needs to be understood is Wilson has been treated like he was used and abused by Manson. Yeah, so the myth, which I sort of have to keep reminding people, what is the cover story is that Manson, this con man and manipulator, swooped in on Dennis Wilson and, like some sort of vampire, parasitically abused him and exploited him. But actually, the opposite is true. Dennis Wilson was looking for someone to give him a cultural spark or inspiration at a time when he was sort of lost. And he recorded one of Manson's songs, and he was greatly impressed with Manson's music. And he recorded with the Beach Boys a song called Cease to Exist, which he changed the name of the song to Never Learn Not to Love. And you can hear that on the 2020 album of the Beach Boys. Well, rather than Manson using Wilson, what happened is that Wilson put this song out on an album without crediting Manson as the songwriter, took credit for him himself, never paid him except for giving him a motorcycle, and Manson never signed a contract because he's quite naive as to the ways of the outside world. He assumed, according to the underworld code, that a man's word is his honor. And a lot of the bad blood that came later came from this, which is not understood. It isn't that Manson never made it in the music industry. It's that he did, and he wasn't compensated. He was not paid, and Dennis Wilson, changed the lyrics to his song, never gave him credit for the song, and basically took it as his own, which I think anyone would be resentful about. So that's a little different than how most people interpret the story. Another important factor, which I'm extending in the new forthcoming edition of the Manson File, a lot more getting into the musical history, because I think that's not sufficiently understood. Not only was Manson sufficiently admired by the movers and shakers and influencers of the Hollywood music industry, But he was given 2 opportunities to record a major album. One was at Brian Wilson's home studio at Bellagio Road that was recorded by Steve Desper, who was the Beach Boys recording engineer. And another was recorded with the Wrecking Crew, which is one of, I don't know if you're familiar with their legend, but they were basically a crack group of session musicians, the finest session musicians in Los Angeles. And basically they recorded all of the music for many of the hit songs of the 60s, from Sonny and Cher, Phil Spector, The Byrds, countless others. You know, you name a hit song from that time. The open secret in the music industry was this group that was colloquially known as the Wrecking Crew. These session people recorded the real music, and that went out on the records to make the band sound better, because they were excellent musicians, sometimes superior to the bands. Well, when you consider one of the best session groups in the world at that time were hired by Terry Melcher to record an album with Manson, that's never been publicly revealed. Nobody knows about that. Similarly, the album that Dennis Wilson sponsored, that was going to be released on the Beach Boys label, has also disappeared from the face of the earth. So both of those record projects would have shown Manson in a very different light. But I could go further with all of his connections, which I do in the book, but to sum it up, this was not an unsuccessful desperate striver trying to get into the music industry. This is somebody that people like Terry Melcher, one of the main rock producers of the time, Neil Young, and many others admired, respected, and were actively trying to promote, as what Carol Kay, who was one of the members of the Wrecking Crew, said that when she met Brian Wilson once at Capitol Records, he introduced her to Manson, who she didn't know at the time, nobody did, and said, he's going to be the next big thing of the 70s. So that just to give you an idea of how long the myth, the public myth of what you think about Manson's connection to the rock world is.
Well, the Beach Boys myth is a pertinent one, and I think I recall a Beach Boys biopic in the 1990s where the character of Charles Manson, though only appearing briefly, he was sort of treated as a hanger-on to the Beach Boys.
Right, that was a really incompetent TV movie in the 90s, and I can remember the scene. He's presented as some kind of horrific horror film stereotype, and they are immediately frightened of him. But that wasn't the case at all. And in the book, in which I can lay this all out in much clearer context, because it's really complicated to counter the myth that people have with the more banal facts. They liked him, most of them liked him. Dennis Wilson admired him and really thought he was a genius. And unfortunately for the Beach Boys myth, Wilson spoke to at least 2 major rock magazines in 1968 and is ranting and raving about how great this new musician Charles Manson is and how they're going to put his record out. So there's a lot of evidence that's seeped into the public, but you'd have to dig for it. Most people believe, as you said, that of course our beloved rock idols immediately recognized he was dangerous and wanted to get away from it. That wasn't the case at all. Now, another odd thing I just wanted to mention in passing, in the recent research that I'm adding to the update of the Manson File, I had discovered something I'd heard rumors about, but many people who I spoke to who knew Dennis Wilson after the murders said that they believed he knew immediately when the Tate-Labianca murders occurred that Manson was involved with it, and that he became just a nervous wreck because he was aware that he was in some way responsible for the murders occurring in a way that he never fully explained to anyone, though he claimed several times he would eventually write a tell-all book about it. So I looked into these rumors and conjectures about this, and as it turns out, several people in the rock world in 1969, before the most famous of these crimes, the killing at Cielo Drive, the killing of Sharon Tate, Sebring, Frykowski, Folger, and Parent, before that happened, people in the rock world actually were sometimes holding vigil, waiting for a hit to be put on them. And they were already knowing that some kind of murder was going to occur. So that hasn't, the pieces of that puzzle haven't fully been put together, but that indicates the degree that the music world, not all of them, but a lot of these people who'd encountered Manson and were links between the social circle around Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski and the Manson commune, which there was a lot of social connection between these people, were already aware before the murders that something was going to happen.
Right, and I've always heard Charles Manson and the murders described as this sort of symbolic end of the counterculture of the 60s. Now, it certainly was a thing, but it certainly wasn't the thing, and certainly not the only thing. However, that certain haze, if you will, that this sort of hung over the Summer of Love in 1967 and then experienced Monterey Pop and Woodstock, it wouldn't only end with the Tate-Labianca murders, but they also experienced the disastrous Altamont Speedway concert a few months later, and then Kent State wasn't far behind that. So I think it's unfair to mark the murders with a stop sign for the counterculture.
I think we have to look at that. That's an important point. We have to look at different levels of it. And then this gets into the political dimensions of the case, which there are as well. I mean, the musical, the political, the spiritual, the psychedelic, they all are important to look at to understanding the mystery of this thing. Politically, basically, what is the Manson myth? It's that a madman got out of prison, hypnotized middle-class, ordinary American kids to kill for him. He was a talentless musician who was spurned by the music industry, and he ended the 60s. I mean, when a hack journalist calls to interview me about this, that's always the story they're going to present, and that's why I refuse to do most interviews, because it's just always the same party line. That's all I can call it. That he ended the 60s, the man who murdered the 60s. Well, the political dimension of it isn't that the Tate-LaBianca murders or Manson ended the 60s. It's that the political currents and tides used the publicity about the Manson murders to destroy the counterculture, if you understand what I'm saying. Who was the governor of California at the time of the Manson murders?
Ronald Reagan.
It was Ronald Reagan, deeply entrenched in protecting the film and music and entertainment industry. He is the entertainment industry, a former actor who had been elected as governor of California basically on the populist promise, I'm going to destroy the counterculture. This hippie stuff's gone too far. We're going to stop it. That's what he ran on in 1966 already. We have to stop these student protests, and you're aware of the way Reagan's career began. But this is very important to understand the human factor of who was in charge of California when the Manson crimes occurred and when the media turned it into this death of the 60s narrative, which I completely refute. What happened was Reagan and who was the president, the newly elected president of the United States, Richard Nixon, Stam Yorty, the mayor of Los Angeles, a deeply corrupt figure, the Los Angeles Police Department, which always has been noted for its corruption and its willingness to cover up crimes if it helps the industry that at that time was the most powerful in Los Angeles, the entertainment industry. These people, and J. Edgar Hoover, they hated the hippie counterculture. We know what the Nixon administration was doing as far as black operations to destroy and defame any kind of protest or activism against the Vietnam War effort. That's been well documented. So you have to consider the death of the 60s narrative was pushed by the Republican Party and its leaders at that time. Basically, it isn't, I do have to say this, I'm sure I've looked at some of your other radio shows and I can see sometimes maybe your listeners would have the idea that I'm sure you've heard this notion or theory that the Manson family, which never really existed, but what's called the Manson family, was some kind of MK Ultra plot to destroy the 60s, that the murders were devised and orchestrated by intelligence agencies with a deliberate intention to destroy the 60s. Have you heard that theory?
I absolutely have, yes.
Yeah, so that is just patently ridiculous. That's putting the cart before the horse in a very naive way. It's more that the crimes occurred and the intelligence agencies and the Republican administration of the time on every level, local California level, local Los Angeles level, and Washington, used it to defame anything to do with LSD, peace, free love, what was viewed as this anarchic social threat from the counterculture. And it worked. They presented Manson and this commune as, this demonic source of evil, and basically it did destroy the hippie movement, but that was not, that wasn't a plot or a plan. It's that the propagandists of the Republican administration and a lot of powerful Democratic Party people used it to undermine and destroy the counterculture. And I think that is perhaps the deepest historical significance of what I can only call the Manson phenomenon, because it's not just the murders, it's a deeper social phenomenon that changed American life. It led to a turning of the tide politically. The counterculture was making strides from 1966 to 1969. Society was changing. There were alternatives to the establishment. The way the media and the government and law enforcement treated these murders and misrepresented them definitely changed the political tide in America. And I think in retrospect, that is the real historical significance of these crimes.
Hey, do you need a place to crash? Come to our ranch. A ranch? There's food, drugs, and Charlie. Who's Charlie? Charlie is everything. We're all one here. What's mine is yours. We don't pair up. Everyone's with everyone.
Charlie Manson is our miracle.
From here.
Do you trust me?
Yes.
There will be blood on these hands. Leave a sign, something witty.
Killed me, not my baby.
Sharon Tate and 4 of her friends were murdered.
We're gonna kill them all. How did the world get so crazy?
Now, we've discussed the Manson circle, those that were with him in Topanga Canyon in '69, so before we get to Tex Watson, let's introduce the girls, specifically Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and Lynette Squeaky Fromme. Now, I've always wondered this, Nikolas. Is there one that Manson really bonded with and liked most?
Well, yeah, remind me of that last question, but again, let me put that in a larger context. Remind me of, is there one that Charlie liked the most? Basically, to even approach that question, we have to again start with a myth. Like I began with, okay, the myth is Manson, the talentless musician who couldn't get anywhere. In fact, a very talented musician who immediately had connections to the highest echelons of the music industry and who were pushing to release an album quickly. In the same way, this idea of that these girls were his followers, his disciples, that Manson was a guru who was leading a cult that was named the Family and that had some sort of coherent ideology, that it was like a predecessor of Jonestown or Heaven's Gate, that kind of cult, is really not at all true. And so to understand the relation of Manson and these young women, one of the most interesting things is to look at the very few documents about Manson and his activities before the murders. And there are a few, like Dennis Wilson speaking about him in the English rock press. There was two psychologists that knew Manson in 1968 did a report basically looking into the counterculture about his commune. And they referred to the group as a group marriage. And from all of my conversations with Manson and the many people involved with him that I've talked to, that's a better way to understand what this group was. And Manson said to me in my film Charles Manson Superstar, you know, I've always had a bunch of broads following me around. And that's the way he describes it. These were his girlfriends. They weren't his disciples. They weren't his followers. That is the language that Bugliosi and the mass media used to convict him and to make it look like they had no agency of their own. They were his mindless, brainwashed disciples. But what has to be understood, it was a group marriage. That phrase, I think, describes it better. So it was a group of women living in a polygamous relationship with a man that then sort of pulled in their tide a couple of other men. But basically what it was about, and originally everyone I've spoken to who knew them at the time, and that's quite a few people in the 60s, knew them as Charlie's Girls, which doesn't sound as sinister as the family. But that's just what they were called. It was him and his girlfriends. So it's everything in this case, the volume is turned up greatly when the media reports it. So you have to remember, these were not disciples, they were his girlfriends. And now, you started with Atkins. The thing about Susan Atkins is people don't realize where did the myth and the legend of Manson as a guru who brainwashed people came from, and the idea that these murders were random. Well, the first source of that was Susan Atkins, who early on, after they were arrested in 1969, in October of 1969, she was the first person to speak about any of the murders that this group of people were involved with. And she spoke about the Hinman murders. And she immediately had a well-known mafia lawyer, Richard Caballero, who was connected to Paul Caruso, legendary Italian-American attorney who had protected many mafia people and who had previously represented a drug dealer deeply connected to the crime and had, the deepest aspect of it is that as soon as Susan Atkins was arrested, mafia attorneys had swooped in to protect her. She told a story to them that was sold to the media, sold to the Los Angeles Times, and then distributed throughout the world, that made it sound like the murders were an attack on random victims for some sort of vaguely defined revolutionary purpose. The idea of helter-skelter didn't come into it at that point. But what you have to know about Atkins is she basically told or was guided to tell the cover story even before anyone knew what had happened. So how does a penniless hippie girl, 19 or 20, have two very expensive lawyers who have been well known to represent underworld and drug dealer figures come in to defend her? They concocted the story with her, I believe, to protect the people really involved and to cover up what was really going on. So Susan Atkins is essential in that she devised and put out the cover story that you know through a book that's forgotten now that was called The Killing of Sharon Tate. And that gets into some of these mafia connections, which we can get into a bit later. But Susan Atkins is important because she was just a habitual liar who claimed, for instance, that she murdered Sharon Tate, that she murdered Gary Hinman. She seems to be like an exhibitionistic, compulsive liar, a fantasist who just made up gory and shocking stories for various reasons, according to her own ever-changing story. Once she told people that she made these stories up because she wanted to scare people in prison because she was trying to protect herself. So she thought if she sounded like a grisly serial killer, they would be more frightened of her and leave her alone. I don't believe that's true. I think she was guided by her public attorneys into telling a cover story that would conceal the true nature of the crimes. So that's an important aspect of Susan Atkins, is people need to realize if you believe the mainstream mass media Manson myth, it is one of the criminals who devised it to conceal the real motives of the murder. Now, when you're asking about them, do you mean what is her personality like, or what kind of person she was?
Well, yes, what I'd like to know is what these young women were like as people. And I say that because we know that the helter-skelter myth that we are fighting is one much like what was portrayed by the trailer of the 2016 Lifetime movie Manson's Lost Girls, which we just heard. Now, they were not zombies who shared one mind, as you mentioned before. Yet I do often feel like their unity at times, such as in that famous clip where they're arm in arm singing as they walk down the hallway, their unity at a time when the bright lights of the media were upon them, that made it seem like they were brainwashed and naively happy. But these were girls who, you know, in some cases were really weathered by life and looking for a better way. And they saw Topanga Canyon as a better way. So, yes, I think we absolutely should know who they were.
Right. Well, they're not zombies is exactly right. The main thing, I think, for anyone new to this case that wants to approach it from a fresh angle to try to understand what is being concealed and what actually happened as opposed to what you've been told for 48 years, forget the whole idea that these were hypnotized people with no will of their own. They had their own agency. These were people who did what they were doing for their own motives. When you drop the whole helter-skelter brainwashing mind control scenario, we have to deal with individual human beings who are responsible for the crimes they committed and did them for the reasons that most criminals commit crimes. There's nothing fantastic about them. So in the case of Susan Atkins in particular, in 1966 she was already roaming around with two thugs as a thief, auto thief, robbing places with them, willfully she was already a criminal. You know, her involvement with dangerous and violent men went on 2 years before she met Manson. So she had every profile. She would seem very likely to be involved in a crime. She was known even in the early part of her Haight-Ashbury period before she met Manson to steal drugs from other people and try to sell them, which, as we will see, is basically what these Manson crimes, as they're called, were really all about, was drug robbery that turned violent and deadly. So Susan Atkins was not an innocent, middle-class, girl next door. From when she was a teenager, she was already drifting into crime in a major way and was deeply involved in drug, not only that drug dealing was made illegal during the 60s, but, she was saying she was willing to kill a policeman in 1966 who was going to arrest her. She was already a hardened criminal by the time she met Manson. You asked how did these girls get involved with him? In her case, now again, all of these legends and stories, they're almost like fairy tales. They've been repeated so often. But from what Manson told me, and I spoke to Atkins once in 1986, I do think basically the story is true. She met him at a drug dealer's party in Haight-Ashbury and heard his voice. He was singing the song The Shadow of Your Smile on guitar, and she was enchanted by his music. And again, it's all about music in this story. That's usually what drew these people to him. But they had a relationship. It wasn't the relationship of a disciple to a religious leader. It was like very typical of the 60s. It was that kind of relationship within a communal marriage. So Atkins was one of the first to join after a librarian named Mary Brunner and Lynette Fromme. She was pretty much the third, fourth to get involved. But that's how she got involved, was she was intrigued with his music, and she got on this school bus that he had got from somebody, and they left Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco together, which was falling into criminality and violence and massive drug abuse, to the point where the Summer of Love had turned into a hippie ghetto of destruction and violence. So to escape from it, they went to Los Angeles. But that's how Susan Atkins got involved. But it's important to understand, anyone who believes the Manson mainstream myth, basically she started it as a defense for her crime, and probably a way to try to defend herself and get off from the crime.
The shadow of your smile, when you are gone, will cover all my dreams and light the dawn. Look into my eyes, my love, and see.
And for those who are curious, yes, that was Charles Manson on a rare recording of The Shadow of Your Smile. Now, let's move to Leslie Van Houten, simply because she's probably the girl that we know best due to her parole hearings. Now, she also, for whatever reason, and maybe you can explain this to us, Nikolas, she's the one that everyone seems to have the, if we're going to let one of them out, it would be her opinion about.
Right. Well, we can begin with her. Leslie Van Houten was the youngest of the women involved with the murders, and she was involved in the murder of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, which was, which much less sensational publicity has been generated about that crime because it didn't involve a movie star or a movie starlet, as the case may be. But she was involved in the LaBianca murder. What her actual beliefs were is very hard to gauge. She was probably the most naive as the youngest of them. Her testimony also seems to have been guided greatly. But if you don't want to get into the parole issue yet, I should reserve judgment on it. But I think that she may well have believed that the reason she was involved in the LaBianca murder was that she actually believed that by committing this murder, it would free her boyfriend, Bobby Beausoleil, who had committed the Hinman murder. And there was this undercurrent discussed among the women that if they could make it look like the killer of Gary Hinman was still active by committing similar crimes, that Beausoleil could be freed. Manson didn't believe that, and I don't think that was the motive for these murders, but I believe it's possible because she was very young, very naive, and incredibly stoned on acid at the time. She probably really believed that's what they were doing. As to what kind of person she was, as I said, she was the youngest and probably the most naive of all of them. However, I've heard from other people who also were doing research into this that, the another part of the myth is that this Manson group were a satanic cult of some kind, which is absolute nonsense. It's not even remotely true. And maybe we need to get into that a bit later too, because it's so widely believed. But just one interesting tidbit, several people before Leslie Van Houten was involved in the Manson group, which was mostly very close to being Jesus freaks in their intense Christianity, far from being devil worshippers. They were very enmeshed in Christian belief. Some people had encountered her at a hippie commune that was actually satanic. So in a way, Leslie Van Houten probably, strangely, had some of the most extreme belief systems of any of these women. Although now she's presented as the most innocent and least crazy of them. What I think is she actually was more ideologically motivated than the others.
And that's interesting because Leslie Van Houten is now portrayed as the most mild of the girls. So let's move on to Patricia Krenwinkel.
Right. Krenwinkel, and she's because this is a media-created story, Krenwinkel's hardly ever mentioned. Most people know nothing about her because she's the least conventionally attractive and glamorous of these women. So she's sort of been shunted aside. But she, along with Charles Tex Watson, if you really want to get down to it, it's the Tex Watson and Krenwinkel murders. She did most of the killing and the actual savagery and mayhem of these very violent crimes, along with Charles Watson, though nobody ever speaks about her much or even remembers her, because they think of Susan Atkins, because again, it's like Hollywood typecasting. Atkins looks like what you could imagine a brainwashed, satanic, hippie murderess would look like, and Krenwinkel doesn't. So it's part of this whole media presentation. But Krenwinkel was, by her own account, a very isolated, lonely young woman who got drawn into Manson's group because he was one of the few people who was ever loving to her or kind to her. And the thing about her is she was the most violent of these people when it came down to it. Susan Atkins, who has the reputation of being sexy Sadie, the evil murderess, doesn't seem to have actually been involved too much in the actual crime. It was Krenwinkel who did a lot of the savagery. That Charles Watson did most of it, but Krenwinkel should be known as one of the murderers, but she's not really thought of that way. She's sort of always shunted to the side. But, as I said, if we were to accurately describe these crimes, they are the Watson-Krenwinkel murders, not the Manson murders. So that's an important thing to consider. But when Manson met her, she was a deeply religious Christian, sort of counterculture Christian, as Manson was. So again, not in any way any kind of occult beliefs or anything that have been projected on these people. She was one of the most pious and Christian of the young women that got attracted to the group. But the thing to remember about her, you sort of have to ask, why is she so unknown? Because she actually did a great deal of the killing, but most people have forgotten her. So that just says something about the misrepresentation and misreporting of the case. It's always the more glamorous or bizarre or grotesque characters like Susan Atkins, who's like central casting as an evil hippie, who gets pushed in the front of the TV show, and Krenwinkel sort of gets lost, as is the next figure, Linda Kasabian.
And what do we know about Linda Kasabian?
Well, again, maybe the most useful way to approach her is to look at the myth and then try to get to what we can discern of the reality. If you look at Helter Skelter, the book, the film, and the way that the mainstream media just regurgitates it mindlessly, this false narrative, Linda Kasabian was a innocent hippie angel who was briefly involved with the Manson group. Now, we have to look at this. She joined, if you could even speak of anything as formal as joining this commune, in July of 1969. And these murders, this crime spree of connected but also disconnected murders that occurred, all happened in August. We are supposed to believe that this woman, who was practically a stranger to Manson, had met him in, I believe, July 4th of 1969, that he would entrust her to go out on this killing mission to create Helter Skelter. But as I got to know Manson, it was clear that he really hardly knew her. I mean, she was there on the Spahn Ranch for a very brief time. What I believe, now the main thing about her myth is the way Vincent Bugliosi presented her. We have to back up a bit here. Vincent Bugliosi first went to Susan Atkins and said, "We will give you immunity, full immunity, if you will testify against the others." And she would have been allowed out if she turned state's evidence against the co-defendants, if you follow me. Well, eventually Bugliosi turned away from that deal and instead found, when Linda Kasabian was arrested, he thought, well, she seems like a more believable witness. I mean, he was a liar, but he was a genius as a prosecutor, and he knew this Linda Kasabian, who looks kind of a much more wholesome figure than Susan Atkins, is going to be a more credible witness for the prosecution. So he basically left Susan Atkins in the lurch, who was going to testify, and made the same deal with Linda Kasabian. So probably what the public knows about her, if they're even aware of the story to this extent, is that she was an innocent girl who sort of got caught up in the crime. The way Bugliosi presented it, the only reason she was sent to the Polanski house on August 8th, 9th of 1969, when these murders occurred, was because she had a valid driver's license. That's what we're supposed to believe is the motivation for this evil, manipulative criminal genius picking a stranger to do this very delicate operation because she was the only one with a valid driver's license. Furthermore, we're supposed to believe she stood outside the house, the Polanski house, when the murders happened. She was horrified by what was occurring. She wanted to break away from them, but she was too terrified. This is the myth Bugliosi presented so that she would be a credible witness against the commune. In fact, according to my research, I believe Kasabian and Watson were the major instigators of that particular night of mayhem. Linda Kasabian, before she was presented as this angelic star witness who had gone wrong, in Boston, where she came from, she had already been arrested in a circle of drug dealers. When she met the Manson commune, Charles Tex Watson immediately, the day he met her, convinced her to steal $5,000 from her husband at the time, which she went and did. So she was already a criminal. She was already a drug dealer. And another interesting factor is she had already been at drug parties at the house next door to where the couple Tate-Labiancas lived. She already was familiar with the house next door to it at a drug party scene that was going on there. So her background was already a criminal, and her initiation into the commune was stealing $5,000 from her own husband to bring to Charles Tex Watson. I believe, though this has not at all been part of the mainstream narrative, that $5,000 ended up buying drugs that eventually created this chain of events that led to the murders that occurred. So far from innocent. Now, why did she instigate these murders with Tex Watson? Is because, as far as my research has indicated, she and Tex Watson had gone to the Polanski house at Cielo Drive and had purchased from Wojtek Frykowski, friend of Roman Polanski's, who was living in his house with his girlfriend Abigail Folger while Polanski was in Europe working on a film. Frykowski was getting into the drug dealing business, financed by Abigail Folger, who was the heiress to the Folger coffee industry. Wojtek Frykowski sold Charles Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian some MDA, what was the originator of what we would today call ecstasy, a slightly different chemical arrangement, but that was the new party drug, the new sensation among the rock and roll and film elite that was experimenting with psychedelics at that time. So Tex Watson, who was a drug dealer, and Linda Kasabian, also deeply involved in drug trade, went to buy some from Frykowski at the Tate House. And exactly what was wrong with it, I haven't been able to determine, but it wasn't good. And so when they tried to sell it to others, they got complaints. And apparently a lot of people in the drug community in that week had purchased bad MDA from Frykowski. And Frykowski had bought it from some Canadian drug dealers, which, as I explain in the Manson File, was also a key factor to the murders and what they were all about, but maybe too complicated to get into with the time allotted here. But the important thing, you have to get this straight. Linda Kasabian, right now, under an assumed name, is living as a free woman, but as far as my research has shown, she instigated the crime that is best known. She and Tex Watson went back to the house to rob Frykowski and Jay Sebring, who was also a drug dealer at the time, to get back at them for what was known in the parlance of 60s drug dealing as burning them on a bad drug deal. So that's what it was all about. And Linda Kasabian, who already, like Tex Watson, had a history of robbery and drug dealing, was just doing her usual M.O. So the horrible irony of it is this woman who's remembered as the angelic savior who blew the whistle on her co-defendants, in my mind, was actually the instigator of the crime. And Bugliosi was cynical enough to make a deal with her simply because she made a better and more credible witness than Susan Atkins. So that's a pretty shocking piece of information. It's been something I've been aware of since the 90s when I really got into the depths of the deception here. You know, you have to let that sink in. She's a free woman. I'm pretty sure she instigated or was the co-instigator with Tex Watson of these crimes. One thing I need to point out for people who are skeptical about that, ever since then, she has been continually in trouble with the law involving drug dealing, methadone. Even her children have become criminals. So, you know, nothing has changed for her. She started as a criminal before she got involved in this commune, and she remained one until very recently, and perhaps to this day. So her criminal record is open and available, but you don't see the mass media ever saying much about it because it blows the story. It just doesn't fit in to the narrative of her as the heroine who innocently got caught up in these murders.
Before we get into the details of August 1969, I'd like to come back to this idea of relationships. With whom did Manson have the best relationship? With whom did he have the most contentious relationship? And who really had a special bond with him?
Right. Well, my gut reaction to that is who he liked the most, from having spoken to him often and written to him even more often since 1985, is the most undiluted affection that Manson has expressed has always been for Lynette Fromme. And again, I could in no way say that I'm speaking for him, because nobody should ever try to do that, because he's too complex to speak for. But my personal interpretation from my conversations with him has been that he had the closest bond to Lynette Fromme. And in saying that, I have to say, as much as I've been able to have a rapport and get along with Manson, he's also a very vindictive, mean-spirited person when you get to know him. He can be generous, he can be kind, but he also has a very wrathful temper. And I've never heard him say anything completely good about anybody, including myself. I mean, that's just sort of the rules of engagement with him. So it's remarkable that the person he's pretty much only had good things to say about is Lynette Fromme. And he's referred to her as his old lady, his woman, almost implying a kind of wifely relationship that I have never heard him say about other people he was involved with. So that's my interpretation of it. They had a genuine love affair, I would say.
Would you happen to know if Manson is still in contact with Lynette Fromme, or if he's even allowed to be?
She was paroled, Lynette Fromme, in 2009, and some of the conditions of her parole is that she's absolutely not allowed to have any contact to Manson whatsoever. And you know, I've had correspondence and contact with her, and I do respect her, and she served her time. So I don't really want to get into intruding on her personal life, but she has followed the conditions, which requires her to have no contact to Manson, which is ridiculous. It's still based on the idea that he's a criminal mastermind who could hypnotize her to commit another crime, which is nonsense, but you have to go along with these things, and she served her time. So I'd rather not get into her personal life and let her enjoy her freedom. Well, you did ask about who did he argue with the most. It's just that, without a doubt, from what he's told me and from what other people who witnessed it, Susan Atkins was always a bone. They had a very deep relationship, but she was far from being a obedient zombie brainwashed follower. Was very disobedient and constantly causing trouble. Very often by she was, I wouldn't call her a prostitute because her sexuality went beyond that, but she was always bringing angry men to the Spahn Ranch looking for her, she had ripped off. She would steal drugs from people and bring, angry drug dealers back to the ranch looking for trouble. So, and she actually broke away briefly from the commune and sort of tried to form her own group, which is a sort of disputed episode in this whole thing when she went to Mendocino. But she sort of struggled with Manson for authority, and yeah, she was a very temperamental person, and he is too, and you can only imagine the fireworks that came from that. But she definitely was the one that he had the most contention with.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you would absolutely attach Watson's name to the murders. So who is Charles Tex Watson?
Well, that is the key question, because if the media and law enforcement and the jurisprudence system in Los Angeles presented this case correctly, we would be talking about the Watson murders, because that's what they were. Again, and I'm sure there's people who are skeptical about what I'm saying, and how could they not be after 48 years of being lied to and being consistently presented nonstop the same barrage of the myth and the fairy tale of Helter Skelter and of the evil manipulator who convinced and brainwashed these young people to kill for him. Of course, they have reason to be skeptical. But we have to remember, Charles Watson is who committed these murders. He's who went there. He's who stabbed these people. And, he is at the center of this thing. And what more important than what exactly went on with the murders is, why has he been erased from history? Why don't people think? For instance, Charles Manson is like the epitome of evil in the public consciousness. He's compared to Hitler, the devil. He's considered the most evil person in American history, I would think. Based on what exactly, though, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say if we really looked at what his pretty banal criminal career has been. All we can prove is he was a pimp, major auto theft, drug dealer, credit card theft, crime on a major level, but not a serial killer, not a murderer. Nobody's ever accused him of physically murdering anyone. On the other hand, Charles Watson, by his own admission, did murder these people, but he claims he did it because he was brainwashed. Basically, if you read his biography and read his parole testimony, that he had no will of his own, he had no volition of his own. But who, as you say, who was this man? Who is this man? Even before he met Manson, he was in the middle tier of Hollywood and Los Angeles drug dealers. He was a clean-cut, good-looking guy from Texas, a former football player, a fairly ordinary, not extremely bright person who was basically drifted into drug dealing because that was an easy way to make money in the 1960s. And now his involvement with Dennis Wilson is also very important to the case. He met Dennis Wilson independently. The story is that he picked up Dennis Wilson hitchhiking in Malibu, and that they befriended each other, and Dennis Wilson, if you can believe this, it's almost laughable, invited him to his house for a cup of coffee. Well, You can use your imagination and think maybe it was for another reason than a cup of coffee or a stronger... In other words, Dennis Wilson met Charles Watson in 1968. And this is another important thing. If you were to really tell the story accurately, which is impossible at this point because of the abundance of the legend and of the myth, if you were to really tell the story the way it is, Dennis Wilson meeting Charles Watson is what another incredibly important factor in setting this whole chain of events. Charles Watson then became, by his own description, a kind of houseboy at Dennis Wilson's mansion. What their exact relationship is, I can't prove, but I'm going to conjecture, and I'm pretty sure, is because Dennis Wilson was a voracious user of drugs of all kind, which everyone he knows can testify to. I'm pretty sure that the main attraction to having Charles Watson live with him, and where he takes a complete stranger into his house, was his drug connection. I also believe, based on things Manson has told me, and other inferences, that they probably had some sort of sexual relationship as well. So it's important to consider that Dennis Wilson brought Charles Watson into knowing, he introduced him to Charles Manson. I don't think a lot of people realize that fact, and if they do, they don't see the significance of it. So the most important thing here is Charles Watson was an independent drug dealer, already a drug dealer, like Linda Kasabian, before he met Manson. From what I can see, he was operating on a more sophisticated network of drug dealers and involved with serious criminals long before he met Manson. And he was not the brainwashed follower that you've been led to believe. He also was not deeply enmeshed in the Manson commune as much as other people. He stayed with a girlfriend in Hollywood. He often left the commune at the Spahn Ranch and had his own independent criminal enterprises going on, which was mostly dealing marijuana, LSD, mescaline, cocaine, and he himself was taking speed, methadone, which is very important into the grotesque and violent nature of the crimes, because he was on speed the night he killed these people in such a vicious and repetitively destructive manner, which a lot of people have commented is typical of methadone murders, that they make you extremely overly violent, and repetitive stabbing is something that people on speed have often been noted to do in the commission of a crime. So Charles Watson was basically an independent drug dealer on the fringes of the Manson group, sometimes deeply involved, but more often off on his own with his own criminal enterprises. That's important to know about him. Also, he was very good friends with Terry Melcher, who lived in the Polanski house before Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski rented it. He already knew Terry Melcher very well. He already knew Dennis Wilson very well. And he had been to parties with Manson at the Cielo Drive house. Dennis Wilson also introduced Sharon Tate to Manson and Watson at some of these parties. And according to Manson, the first time he met Sharon Tate was at the home of Elvis Presley when Elvis was in Las Vegas. Some people who were a part of what was called the Memphis Mafia that Manson knew, Dennis Wilson knew them, and they would go to gambling parties held at Elvis's house. And that's where he first met Sharon Tate. So it's important to understand Tex Watson was deeply involved with the people that were murdered. He knew Frykowski as a fellow drug dealer. He knew J.C. He knew Sharon Tate. Wasn't a friend of hers, but was on nodding terms seeing her at parties, knew of her lifestyle. So that's very important to know. He was not an impoverished hippie. He was a fairly well-dressed mod, retinue of the Hollywood party scene. And he was a pretty major drug dealer who was trying to work his way up in the drug dealing hierarchy when these murders occurred. And I believe, from having spoken to Manson about these crimes very often over many years. I don't even think Manson ever was fully aware of the activities of Charles Watson. I don't think he knew exactly what he was up to. Not all of it. And that's very important in why there are still mysteries that endure about these crimes.
Now let's go back to August 9th and 10th, 1969, the Tate-Labianca murders. Right. What happened? Who is most responsible for the murders? And maybe most importantly, why did they happen?
Well, I think one of the reasons why it's so hard to understand the complexity of this case is that crime that happened at Cielo Drive, the murder of Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Frukowski, Folger, and Parent, is given so much emphasis that you aren't really shown the full narrative that led to it and how that crime then led to the crimes that occurred afterwards. I mean, for the most part, I think the average person who is not deeply involved in trying to understand this case or what actually happened has the idea that Manson sent his hippie followers out to murder people to start a race war that was supposedly called Helter Skelter, and that it didn't really matter who he killed as long as people were viciously murdered, and that would supposedly inspire blacks to rise against white people. And that, now, it doesn't make any sense. It never did make sense to me even when I read Helter Skelter when it came out in 1974, the book by Vincent Bugliosi. That's what I mean, isn't that what you would say is what most people believe happened?
Yes, I would think so.
And furthermore, whatever people may believe, they believe Charles Manson is absolutely the supposed, and it's a ridiculous melodramatic word for this confused and actually failure of a crime. He's supposed to be the mastermind of these murders. To understand what happened that night, August 8th and 9th of 1969, you have to look at a series of other crimes that Watson committed before that, which are pretty much either omitted from the narrative or placed in the wrong context. If you don't mind, I think it's important as an introduction to get into that. First of all, on July 1st of 1969, Watson engaged in one of his usual criminal procedures, which was he was a drug dealer, but he would rob drug dealers and steal their supply because they're not going to call the police and say, hey, I was just robbed of my drugs. So this was his MO. That's basically what he did. He did it several times, and I get into a very important, even earlier attempt to rob a drug dealer that occurred in April of 1969, but that may be a little too complicated for what we need to get into. In July of 69, he tried this with a major drug dealer and criminal named Bernard Crowe, whose nickname was Lotsapapa. And Bernard Crowe, he basically said, I'm going to go get some marijuana for you. Crowe gave him some money to buy the drugs, and Watson left his own girlfriend, a woman named Rosina Kroner, with this drug dealer, Lotsapapa, or Bernard Crowe, and took off with the money and didn't bring the drugs back to him. Well, that would tell you something about the character of Charles Watson, that he would leave his own girlfriend as collateral with an armed drug dealer and some other thugs that were in the place. He did that, and this was July of 69. Bernard Crowe, through Rosina Kroner, got the number of the Spahn Ranch and called and asked for Charles. And there was one payphone at the ranch. The phone was given to Charles Manson rather than Charles Watson, because they were both Charlies. This guy, Bernard Crowe, who was kind of like a superfly black drug dealer type of the time, threatened to come and burn down the ranch and kill everyone there, something to that effect, to Manson, if you don't give me back my money now. You follow me so far? So Manson hears this threat, and he and T.J. Wallerman, a friend of his, he met on the Spahn Ranch, who was working there, but who was a Vietnam vet who had some experience with firearms. They both went to an apartment house in Hollywood on Franklin, and where this guy was, Bernard Crowe. And Manson brought a gun with him, and he basically tried to free Rosina Kroner, Tex Watson's girlfriend, from Bernard Crowe. In the process of that, and there's been many different descriptions of what exactly occurred, and T.J. Wallerman, who was there when it happened, told me his version of the story. Manson has told me his. There have been many accounts of exactly what happened. But basically, Manson, in the process of this visit to Bernard Crowe to try to get Rosina Kroner back from him, shot Bernard Crowe with the gun. He thought that he had killed him, but he actually didn't. And that's a whole other complicated story. I don't actually believe that they believed that they had killed Bernard Crowe for very long, but that's the legend that has endured. So Manson shot this well-known drug dealer who was very deeply tied in with the Hollywood and music industry drug scene, and he thought he'd now murdered someone. And this is someone who, you have to remember, Manson is reporting to a parole officer diligently and trying to avoid being sent back to prison. At this very point is right at the time when a film documentary was going to be made by Greg Jacobson, a friend of Terry Melcher's, about the Spahn Ranch to promote Manson's music. They were going to produce a documentary along the lines of Woodstock, which had come out in 1969 as well. Yeah, so the idea was, this was in July of 69, Manson was ready to put out one of these several albums, one that was made but recorded at Gold Star Studios with the Wrecking Crew by Terry Melcher, the other one that had begun to be worked on with Steve Desper and the Beach Boys. His career was moving in the direction of finally this album would be released and they would make a documentary about this group that at that time Greg Jacobson, who was Terry Melcher's talent agent, called The Family. At that time they needed a name, and that's where the name came from. So now he's committed this crime. He shot a major drug dealer. Word spreads to Terry Melcher and Dennis Wilson and the entire music people circle that he was involved with, that Manson's nickname among these people was Crazy Charlie. And when Dennis Wilson and Terry Melcher and other people in the rock industry heard that he had now shot this guy, they dropped him completely. Although Melcher and Wilson maintained some slight contact, they then thought, okay, he's too unstable to continue with our plans to pursue his recording career. So it wasn't that he didn't have a recording contract or wasn't being taken seriously. It's that he was on the brink of his music career actually taking off when his friends or supporters in the music industry dropped him because of this crime. So now Manson is angry at Watson because he's gone in there and shot a man basically to rescue his girlfriend. And he feels like Tex Watson has dragged him into a crime that wasn't even his doing. You know, and you can argue that either way. Was it a stupid macho action to go in there with a gun? Possibly. But in either case, Manson felt, all right, to Charles Tex Watson, that he had been dragged into his drug dealing business, and now he could go back to prison because of what he's done. And it's totally destroyed his chances at any kind of recording career whatsoever. Not that that was that important to him, but you can understand the emotional fallout of that happening. So he's very angry at Charles Watson. Shortly thereafter that, there's a lot of tension between Watson and him, because now, according to the Underworld Code, Manson has gone in and shot the guy, and therefore Tex Watson owes Manson. And this is a phrase he said to me and many other people over and over again. I told Tex, now you owe me one. You owe me for what I've done for you. Now that can be interpreted in many ways. Now a sort of surge of chaos occurs because some people know about the shooting in the Spahn Ranch circle in the commune, and other people it's not known. And there's a kind of paranoia that starts to spread on the ranch, which previously it wasn't really like that. To make matters worse, Bobby Beausoleil, who, like Tex Watson, was sometimes part of the commune and sometimes independently and on his own, and was really more of an independent figure, certainly never a follower of Charles Manson. Like a lot of the men that were involved with the Spahn Ranch group, he wasn't really living there all the time, and he wasn't an integral part of the group as the women were. He had sold some drugs that he bought from this fellow Gary Hinman that I mentioned earlier in context with the Topanga Canyon Corral. He bought some mescaline from them. $1,000 worth of it is usually the agreed upon amount, because a biker club named Straight Satans that were hanging around the Spahn Ranch, and which I believe Manson was in touch with even earlier than that, were celebrating their 10th anniversary, and they wanted mescaline to help push the festivities into a higher dimension. So Bobby Beausoleil wanted to, in some way or the other, gain the respect of the Straight Satans, this biker club. And he purchased the mescaline from Gary Hinman, and as I told you with Linda Kasabian and Charles Watson, with Frykowski, something about the mescaline was wrong. It was wrongly made. Something was defective about it, and some of these bikers in the Straight Satan fell ill. Manson told me that one of the women of the Straight Satans had a miscarriage, so instead of having a joyous celebration, it turned into getting a lot of the bikers sick at this 10th anniversary party. Danny DiCarlo, who was you could say the treasurer of this biker club, the Straight Satans, who was hanging around the Spahn Ranch, put a gun in Bobby Beausoleil's hands, and Beausoleil was a very young man at this point, not a hardened criminal like some of the others, and said, you better go back and get our money. So this is the same story you're starting to see again and again. It's about drug deals gone wrong, and we want our money back. So Beausoleil goes back to Gary Hinman, who's a friend of his, Manson's, and says, I need the money back. It's a complicated story, and there's, again, many different versions of what actually happened. In essence, it turns into an argument. At some point, Manson comes to Gary Hinman's house in Topanga Canyon, and sort of like he did with the Charles Watson misadventure with Bernard Crowe, if you're following the pattern here, he goes back to warn Hinman. He says, you better pay him back, and he cuts him on the ear and the side of the face with a sword that's like in a pirate cutlass shape. And this sword belonged to the Straight Satans, belonged to a member of this biker club, the Straight Satans. When he cuts Hinman and then he leaves, sort of as to give him a warning, you better pay Beausoleil what you owe him, of course now he's committed another felony that could place him back in prison. At some point after that, Beausoleil got into an argument with Hinman after Manson had left the premises and killed him. So you have now Manson believes he's killed this drug dealer, Lotsapato, or Bernard Crowe. Now word starts to spread that Bobby Beausoleil has killed Gary Hinman because Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner had gone with him and they witnessed the crime. So they know now that Bobby Beausoleil had killed this friend of theirs, Gary Hinman. The important thing here is let's look at the pattern. What are these crimes about? It's a drug dealer that the people in Manson's group are very familiar with. Violence occurs against a drug dealer based on a drug deal that's gone wrong, a so-called burn. So now, okay, these are totally banal crimes like are happening in the underworld at this very moment, and it's about the most routine kind of crime you can imagine. One drug dealer being angry at another and either committing violence or killing them. Nothing could be more common. It happens in gang land all the time. Suddenly, we're supposed to believe that the next crime, which was committed on August 8th and 9th of 1969, when Frykowski, Tate, Sebring, Parent, and Folger were killed, we're supposed to believe that this falls outside the scope of drug dealers who know each other killing other drug dealers. I don't believe that's true. I believe that, as I said before, Watson and Kasabian went back to do exactly the same thing as we've seen. They had been burned by Frykowski and possibly Sebring, though I'm not quite sure about that part of it. They wanted to go back to rob them, and it turned into the mayhem that occurred. It was intended as a violent robbery, and they wanted to get J. Sebring's stash of drugs because J. Sebring was a major cocaine dealer. They wanted to go back to his house, which was near the Cielo house. It was on Eastern Drive in the same neighborhood, and get his stash of drugs. It turned into a violent confrontation, largely because of Sharon Tate's unexpected presence. They were hoping to go there to do a robbery and get away with a huge shipment of drugs that had been delivered just that evening. And that's a very important part of the case. Who delivered the drugs to the Tate residence that night? In fact, we now know that the FBI was observing that drug dealer and many of the other narcotics operations that were going on with these people. So the FBI were watching the inhabitants of the Tate house and this drug dealer who brought drugs to them. That's what Kasabian and Watson were trying to steal. So it's, if you can see the narrative, basically it continues to be a pattern of drug dealer stealing and killing drug dealer. That's what this is about. Sharon Tate, the people who committed the murder went out of their way to make sure she would not be there, because obviously they don't want a celebrity being involved in this, because that's going to attract, unwanted publicity to this. So they even went out of their way to make sure she wasn't there. How did they know that? That gets into many more mysteries. But the fact is, because she was supposed to be, Sharon Tate, spending the night while she was heavily pregnant and due to deliver her child, she wasn't feeling well, and she was going to spend the night with her best friend, a woman named Wells. She wasn't supposed to be there, and the group of people who murdered her didn't think she'd be there. When she appeared, J. Sebring tried to protect her. It's a complicated story, again, that would take another hour to even begin to explain. But briefly, it turned into a physical fight between Sebring and Tex Watson, who I have to add was on methadone and had been for days. So he's a speed freak, freaking out as he gets into a violent confrontation when he's hoping to rob J. Sebring and Frykowski of their drugs. It turned into violence that wasn't intended, and then it turned into a slaughter thereafter, basically because there can't be any more witnesses to the crime. That's the gist of what happened that night. To a degree, among the people on the Spahn Ranch, there had been discussion of committing a copycat murder, and I'm sure you've heard this theory, to make it look like the murderer of Gary Hinman was still loose, and Bobby Beausoleil had been arrested on August 6th. So right before that, he'd been arrested, and obviously they were concerned that he would talk about Manson's involvement, or somehow it would come back to the ranch of their involvement in the crime. So there was a lot of paranoia and tension after these crimes had committed. Now, the other factor, which Manson has said to me since 1985, pretty much whenever the crimes have come up, is that it was really all about the need to pay back the straight Satans who were aware that he had committed these felonies, the shooting of Bernard Crowe, the cutting of Gary Hinman with a weapon that belonged to them, which implicated them in the crime. So they were insisting they needed even more money from Manson and his group. In a way, you could say it was a sort of extortion. The straight Satans were pushing Manson to pay them back, and they weren't satisfied with what they were getting, which included some cars that were taken from Gary Hinman. That wasn't considered sufficient payment. So this increased desperate activity to steal drugs and to rob people was basically to pay back the straight Satans. Manson knew that, Whether the other people in his group knew it, I can't say. I kind of doubt it. Retro-engineering what I've seen of the way Manson compartmentalizes his life and on a need-to-know basis only tells people what they need to know about what's happening. I think this was Charles Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian's effort to bring money into the communal pool, but I think it was an independent activity of their own. And of course it was not going to kill random strangers to start a race war, which is just intrinsically absurd. It was for the same reasons as the two crimes before. So that's what happened that night. We can get into the mechanics of the actual crime, but, you know, even the chronology of how these people were killed is different than you have been led to believe, for reasons that make sense in terms of the cover story. And in the Manson File, I explain from what I believe and from what I have gleaned from people who talk directly to the murderers in prison, where, of course, they tell a very different story than they tell to the parole board, to their lovers and to fellow prisoners. When you go to the parole board, you have to, I don't think a lot of people realize this, you cannot say, I lied in court, that isn't what happened. You have to go along with what you've been convicted for if you have any hope of gaining parole. So the convicted murderers, in this case, at their parole boards, continue to repeat the story that they were hypnotized by Manson to murder for these very vague reasons. Even they themselves don't tend to offer much credence to the helter-skelter nonsense that Bugliosi pushed. But, that, you know, from what I have gleaned of what actually happened, it was nothing like what you keep being told is happening.
For the audience, I do want to actually explore the mechanics of the murders. So much has been said and written, obviously so much from the mainstream media, but from your research, who killed whom on those nights?
I would say you have to consider that almost everything you say as a fact about this case is questionable, because the stories have, but sort of like the JFK assassination, a big problem with it is that these people have repeated their cover stories and their narrative so often that they've all blurred together into a mess. And as has been proven, even witnesses of a crime describe them wrongly. If they keep describing them, they start changing the details. And fact turns into fiction very quickly when you're under that kind of pressure, when you're being interrogated, all of that. So you have to consider, I believe there are great mysteries about what occurred in that house, when they occurred, who was responsible for them. One of the things I need to bring up here, which is one of the most enigmatic peculiarities of the whole thing, and nobody thinks about it very much unless they've really studied the case. Imagine this scenario. This hideous murder occurs, shooting, stabbing, screaming. William Garretson was in the guest house at Cielo Drive. He was a young man who Rudy Altobelli, the owner of the property, who had rented it previously to Terry Melcher and who now rented it to Roman Polanski. This young man was the houseboy of Rudy Altobelli. He was watching the guest house on the property while Rudy Altobelli was away in Europe. William Garretson claimed at first, when the police arrived the next day to find this carnage, this, bloody scene in the front house and on the front lawn, that he didn't hear anything that night. Why, if these killers had gone to kill everyone in the house, which is the legend that Manson supposedly ordered Tex Watson to go there and kill everybody, why would this young houseboy be spared? How could he have not heard anything? I have the police reports in which neighbors pretty far away heard screaming, shooting, reported it even. He didn't hear anything. He didn't see anything, according to his first story to the police. This is one of the ultimate mysteries of the whole case, is what was William Garretson's role? Did he know in advance that this was going to happen? There are some indications of that. Was he complicit in some way in what happened? Did he cooperate or enable what happened? And Another thing to keep in mind is another person that's completely usually written out of the whole thing is Steve Parent, this teenager who was killed in the driveway, who you may vaguely recall, was visiting William Garretson that night, supposedly at midnight to sell him a clock radio. And again, like Dennis Wilson and Tex Watson supposedly being invited over for a cup of coffee, I don't believe Steve Parent was going to this notorious drug and party house about an alarm clock. But that's the official story. So, there are so many mysteries about that one evening alone, let alone all the other crimes. Just think about that. He survived the night, supposedly didn't hear anything. He was arrested as the main suspect the next morning when the murders were discovered. And the story he told the police, and I've read the report, it's publicly available, is completely hard to accept whatsoever, what he tells them. So, to what degree was this young man, William Garretson, complicit in or in some way aware of why and what happened? The problem, as is true with almost everyone involved in this case, later in life he told such ridiculous stories. For instance, in the 90s, he got involved with a woman who claimed to be, as absurd as this sounds, the unborn child of Sharon Tate. She claimed that she was cut out of Sharon Tate's womb. And then this guy, William Garretson, actually promulgated this idiotic story that this woman was Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate's child. So he completely blew. And you can look into that. He really seemed to believe that. And unfortunately, he said a lot of interesting things that are very incriminating, implying that other people were even involved with these murders or knew about them. But we have to look at it all with a huge grain of salt because of the insane, you can't even grace them by calling them conspiracy theories. So he's an important part of the case, but we can't really believe on face value a lot of what he said. And that's a crucial factor that is almost always ignored. Why would these people leave him alive after so brutally slaughtering everyone at the place? Also, how much did Rudy Altobelli, the owner of the house, who also had mafia connections and who Manson had far greater dealings with than was ever previously known, how much did he know about the nature of the crime? These are important questions that I go much deeper in the Manson File, but there's things for the casual listener to begin to realize the reason you don't know what this is all about is because you need to look deeply into the lives of these obscure personalities on the fringes of the case who should be better known, if you can see the pattern forming there.
Manson idolized the Beatles. He thought they were prophets, and they were sending out messages beneath the lyrics of their songs, not only to him, but to other tuned-in people. And the Beatles came out with this album, I think they call it the White Album. It was all white. So Manson gets a hold of the album, and he comes back to the ranch, and he's all excited. And he tells the members of his family, the Beatles are telling it like it is. Helter Skelter's coming down. Helter Skelter to Manson meant the last final destructive war among men on the face of this earth. He called it Helter Skelter. There's another song on that album that they played quite a bit, Blackbird. And there's a verse in the song Blackbird about blackbirds fixing their wings, rising up and flying. So Manson told his family that by Blackbird, come on, we know what the Beatles are talking about. They're talking about the black man. And they're telling the black man to rise up against the white man. There's another song in that White Album called Piggies. To Manson, piggies were the white establishment. And the Beatles are saying in Piggies that the piggies deserve a damn good whacking. Showing you the connection between these songs and these murders. Certainly Helter Skelter was his primary motive. And the killers, that was their only motive, to follow Manson and start Helter Skelter. Manson had two other supplementary motives, one of which was this extreme hostility towards society. I don't think there's any question that on these two nights of murders, he was viciously striking out at the establishment, particularly to that Tate residence where he'd been booted off the premises. He didn't know who the victims were, but he sensed they were members of the entertainment industry, and he was striking out at the establishment. And then a third motive was his passion and his lust for death, blood, and murder. Talked about it all the time.
What did you think of Manson when that thing happened?
I don't know what I thought when it happened. I just think a lot of the things he says are true. That he's a child of the state, made by us, and he took their children in when nobody else would, is what he did. But of course he's cracked, all right.
But what was your feelings when he said, well, he was helter-skelter?
Well, he's balmy. He's like any other Beatle kind of fan who reads mysticism into it. I mean, we used to have a laugh putting this, that, and the other in a light-hearted way that some intellectual would read as some symbolic youth generation what's it. But we also took seriously some part of the role, you know. But, I mean, I don't know, what's helter-skelter got to do with knifing somebody? You know, I've never listened to the words properly of helter-skelter. It was just a sort of a noise, you know.
That was prosecuting attorney Vincent Bugliosi, the author of Helter Skelter and the perpetuator of the Helter Skelter myth. You just heard him explain that myth. Now, you also heard John Lennon's response when asked what he thought of Charles Manson and his supposed use of Helter Skelter. Now, I get a feeling that Lennon didn't really buy the myth, but that's just my view. Bugliosi is interesting to me, however, in that he was heavily chided by researchers for his faulty work on the JFK assassination, yet many researchers have never questioned his work on Manson. So what I want to ask you, Nikolas, is why do you think Vincent Bugliosi stayed firm on his story until the day he died, and why do you think he wasn't challenged?
Well, when I began researching the book, I just, in the 80s, I think maybe I need to back up a little bit about how I even began researching it when you asked me, but that gets into Bugliosi. When I contacted Manson in 1985, it was again to do this musical recording. That was our original plan. And then a book called Manson in His Own Words by Newell Emmons was just about to come out. And Newell Emmons was a criminal associate of Manson who did him a favor earlier in his career before his notoriety, and as a payback, Manson let him write the exclusive autobiography of him, ghostwrite it, so to speak. To make a long story short, Manson was extremely dissatisfied with what Newell Emmons published as Manson in His Own Words, as he felt it had totally not presented his points of view and had even included fictional statements, which are very complicated, and again, I can't get into. So he said to me, could you put together a book that would have my real words? Can you put together something that will... He was so angry at Manson in His Own Words, he wanted a sort of alternative counter version of that. So with his cooperation, I put together the first edition of the Manson File, which was very different, the 1988 edition, from the 2011 and the forthcoming new edition of it, because it was basically a compilation of Manson's own philosophy and music, which was practically unknown at that time. Only then, after that book was published, did I really start to understand through conversations with Manson the degree to which the case Bugliosi presented had nothing to do with reality. It took a few years of casual conversations with Manson for myself to even fully understand the extent of the deception. So then, when the Manson File came out, and when before the film Charles Manson Superstar was made, through a lawyer in Beverly Hills who had the entire transcript of the court proceedings, which at that time was not publicly available, but he had been researching the case. And he believed that Bugliosi should not even be allowed to be a lawyer. He believed that this was complete malfeasance, that witnesses had been coached, people had been paid off, that in no way was that a fair trial. And many other people in the legal community, as you said, were extremely suspicious of Bugliosi. When I read the trial transcripts, I saw the extent of how incredibly flimsy the case actually is. And you don't really realize what an insubstantial case it is. It is based completely on the hearsay of Linda Kasabian, who is basically allowed to have her freedom and her life rather than being sentenced to death for telling the story that Bugliosi wants her to tell. It's an incredibly flimsy case if you really look at it. If you get away from the self-aggrandizing book that Bugliosi was already preparing to write even when he took the case on, because he wrote the book Helter Skelter, as I said in my own book, as a way of establishing his credentials to try to become the Attorney General of California. It was a political ambition, and he wanted to paint himself as a hero. So when I read the transcripts, I couldn't believe just how fantastic the idiotic case really was, when you really see every detail of it. And only now are other people, as it's slowly becoming public, starting to see what, an absurd prosecution that was. Secondly, a lot of people don't realize, when they consider, as many people still do, that Bugliosi was a brilliant legal mind and a great prosecutor, no defense was put on. Do you realize that the prosecution ended its presentation of its case and the defense rested? So there was no defense. There was nothing else that was going to happen but that Bugliosi's prosecution was victorious. See, a lot of people they think there was a defense. There was none. Based on that, me and a few other associates actually began getting a legal fund together to get a new trial for Manson. The whole saga of that could be a whole other encyclopedia, so I'll skip the details. But in the process of that, I understood exactly to what degree Bugliosi lied, concocted, airbrushed out important details, refused to allow certain witnesses to speak who would blow his story, intimidated, coached, and really persuaded people to commit perjury, which are all felonies, of course. I mean, the man should not have been allowed to practice law. And most legal authorities look at the case as a disaster, not as a masterful legal procedure, but as the exact example of how one should not run a fair trial. But it was only then that I realized the extent that this is all Bugliosi's invention, sort of piggybacking, no pun intended with the pigs, but on Susan Atkins' original bizarre story that her lawyers, Caballero and Caruso, had concocted. So that's what's important to understand, is Bugliosi was not a great lawyer. There was no defense put on, and the whole trial was really a foregone conclusion from the beginning. Manson had been declared guilty in public opinion because of this earlier Killing of Sharon Tate book and all the news stories that basically presented him as guilty. Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, had deliberately, and there is a tape recording of Nixon, which I quote in the book, in which Nixon later admits, he says, "I knew exactly what I was doing when I said Manson was guilty." I believe that's how deep the conspiracy to cover up what was going on was, and how deeply Bugliosi was implicit in pushing a deliberate cover story deceptively.
On his way back to Washington from San Clemente today, President Nixon stopped in Denver to talk to a meeting of law enforcement officials, and then he called a news conference where he charged the news media tend to glorify and to make heroes out of criminals. Reading from notes he had in his hand, he said, unless this glorification of those obstructing justice is stopped, the system will break down. And then the president made the flat statement that Charles Manson, who is on trial for his life in Los Angeles, is guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders. A few minutes later, his press secretary called back and said he was retracting the president's statement because he had failed in referring to Manson, failed to use the word alleged. But by then, the trial in Los Angeles had been thrown into a small uproar.
When you and I discussed Vincent Bugliosi earlier this week, you also told me that there were other ties between the Manson case and the JFK and RFK cases. Is that correct?
Yeah, and to pull back a little and to see the big picture, it's always tricky to make a narrative of history because we like to make things neat and tidy and make sense. But as a working hypothesis for what this is all about, the deeper level of it, you could say that the phenomenon called the 60s began in Dealey Plaza with the murder of John F. Kennedy, which created an uncertainty in authority that had never existed in the USA before. It made people doubt that our leaders are telling us the truth. It created the state of disinformation that we still live in now to an even more horrific degree. It created the causes and conditions of the counterculture, because the Kennedy assassination, at the time when beatniks were sort of a fringe phenomenon on the side of society, and there was the beginning of the anti-war movement, that assassination and the mysteries around it and the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby is what made young people doubt their government, doubt that the establishment was reliable, trustworthy. I personally believe that was a coup. But, I don't think we can get into all the details of that. But the 60s began with a murder of Kennedy that was covered up and misreported by the media deliberately to protect the powerful. And it ended with a murder, the Tate-Labianca murders, that, according to the traditional mainstream narrative, ended the 60s. There are so many connections between the two cases that I think if we survive long enough to ever tell the full history of what happened in those years from 1963 to 69, and all of the violence, all of the still unsolved assassinations, Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, etc., and onwards, to the final blow of the Tate-Labianca murders. If we could ever understand that, you would see that it is one phenomenon of the interlinking of the underworld taking control of American society in collusion with intelligence services in a period of chaos after what I believe was actually a state-sponsored coup. And the social upheaval of the 60s, the hippie movement, what has been called the counterculture, was at least in part a reaction to the Kennedy assassination. And even when you consider, as is well known, the very day of the Kennedy assassination is when the Beatles' first album was actually manufactured. The actual physical album was made that day. So Kennedy died, and that Beatles' first album that was like that was the shot that started the counterculture. They both happened November 22, 63. An interesting coincidence is that Sharon Tate is a Texan born in Dallas, and X. Watson, who murdered her, is also from Texas, and he left to Los Angeles from Dallas. And where was he working? As for Braniff Airlines, he was working at Love Field, where, of course, Kennedy landed before his fatal ride to Dealey Plaza. So there's even that strange coincidence, is that the two bookmark murders of the 60s, Kennedy and Tate-Labianca, had this Texan-Dallas connection. Now, the specific connections are, I go into them in great detail and even further in the new edition of the book. I'll just think of some at random. Number one, Jay Sebring, one of the victims at Cielo Drive, and Sharon Tate's ex-fiancé and boyfriend, and perhaps continued to be her boyfriend up to the time of the marriage, up to the time of the murders, knew the Rat Pack, which was the nickname for the group of people, Frank Sinatra, Joey Bishop, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and a few others, Dean Martin, and Jay Sebring was their hairdresser. Frank Sinatra had brought Jay Sebring into show business, and through their underworld mafia connections, because Jay Sebring already was a drug dealer even before he met Sinatra, Sinatra brought him into this circle of Las Vegas underworld entertainment, the Rat Pack. Through that connection, through Peter Lawford, who was John F. Kennedy's brother-in-law, Peter Lawford gave drugs to Kennedy and J. Sebring this is important, sorry. Peter Lawford acquired drugs from J. Sebring to give to John F. Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe when they would have their private affair that happened largely at Peter Lawford's home. J. Sebring was a supplier of those drugs. So he also cut Kennedy's hair. So he was part of this underworld mafia connections that, of course, tie into John F. Kennedy's father's mafia connections, which are very well known. So that's the first connection. J. Sebring was like the hairdresser and drug dealer to the Rat Pack. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis, he was their drug dealer in the early 60s. And Sharon Tate was part of that circle, because she was involved with Sebring since 1964. So that's one major connection. When I spoke to Virginia Graham, I interviewed her, the woman who Susan Atkins supposedly gave her, quote, confession to, which I believe was a coached and arranged meeting, also arranged by the criminal underworld to put across this cover story. Virginia Graham, now think about this for a minute. The woman who coincidentally heard the confession of Susan Atkins, which, as you may know, is what broke the Tate-Labianca murders, was a friend of J. Sebring. She had been involved with many mafia figure and leaders for decades before that. She was basically a prostitute, a madam. She happened to be the person who heard what the murders were really about, supposedly, from Susan Atkins. She was a friend of J. Sebring, a friend of Frank Sinatra, a friend of many, and lover of many of these underworld figures. So that's, I believe, who was planted in the prison to take this false confession. So that gives you some idea of the complicity of these people. So that's one direct connection. J. Sebring also, because he was providing drugs for JFK and Marilyn Monroe, for Peter Lawford, who was also, like J. Sebring, a sadist who was interested in sadomasochism, and that was one of their bonds of their friendship, and a major drug abuser, Peter Lawford. Because of the mafia connections with JFK, the meetings between Marilyn Monroe and Kennedy were recorded so that the mafia could extort or hold them over his head to make him do the promises that his father had made about Cuba and all that kind of thing. So the mafia actually recorded Monroe and Kennedy intimately, and Sebring in the late 60s or mid-60s, after JFK's murder, would play the tapes at parties of Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe together. It would be like a party favor. And he was kind of a braggart, Sebring, who wanted people to know that he had friends in powerful and sinister places. He never really made any secret of it. It was an open secret. So that's the first connection. One of the murder victims was deeply ensconced in the mafia atmosphere around the Rat Pack and the Kennedy administration, which is, I think, very well known to your listeners. I don't think I have to explain what it's about. Now, why would Vincent Bugliosi want to cover up what the exact nature of these murders were about? I think it deeply gets into many other connections. And I'll just mention one, because we could do an entire show about only the connections between the JFK Warren Commission cover-up and the Manson cover-up, because they're the same personnel. Do you know the name Lawrence Schiller at all?
Part of what I know, yes, is that he was a true crime author.
This is the most significant way to explain the connections between the cover-up of the JFK murder and the cover-up involved in the so-called Manson murders, what the real motive and what the real purpose of these murders were and who was involved with it. Schiller was a friend of Paul Caruso and Richard Caballero, these lawyers who were well known for representing mafia figures like Mickey Cohen and other people and other drug dealers deeply involved on the fringes of the Cielo Drive and Manson Circle. Caballero and Caruso became Susan Atkins' public defenders. This guy Schiller was a friend of theirs. They brought him in to sell Susan Atkins' story to the Los Angeles Times and to the European media, and basically to spread the cover story to the mass media as widely as possible. And he put his name on basically what was a interview or a transcription of a tape that Atkins supposedly made that told the story of what happened. And that book was called The Killing of Sharon Tate. Now, who was Lawrence Schiller? 2 years before this guy is brought in to present the public with its first story of what these killings were about, he was an informant to the FBI working on the side of the Jim Garrison trial, which I'm sure your listeners understand the significance of that. Lawrence Schiller, a lot of people don't know, was the person who put across to the FBI and to the investigators of the Garrison case that Clay Shaw, this New Orleans businessman who Garrison, as you know, claimed was one of the conspirators who funded the Kennedy assassination. You know who he was. Lawrence Schiller is who told the FBI and the Garrison investigators that Clay Shaw's pseudonym in the homosexual underworld of New Orleans was Bernard.
Clay Bertrand, yes.
And that's a significant part of what came out in the JFK movie by Oliver Stone. It's probably how. So he did that. Lawrence Schiller was in Dallas on November 22, 1963. He took one of the most famous pictures of Oswald in the hallway of the police department. He acquired, because he was the business manager for Jack Ruby, even before the murders, he acquired the famous photograph of Ruby killing Oswald and sold it to the media in 1963. So this is an FBI informant who was trying to counter the Garrison investigation. And he also was one of the first people, Schiller, to write a book against against Mark Lane and the people who were criticizing the Warren Commission. He wrote one of the very first books that, basically made it sound like these people are crazy conspiracy theorists, etc.
Now, if I remember correctly, I believe he also co-wrote, or at least collaborated with, Norman Mailer on Oswald's Tale, and then I think he had some involvement with the made-for-TV movie The Trial of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Absolutely. It's really amazing the degree which Lawrence Schiller, he's had a very versatile and prolific career as a kind of hustler who gets involved in infamous crimes. O.J. Simpson, Gary Gilmore, he's Johnny on the spot. Yeah, he's the first guy there to get the deal. Let me write the book about it. But the persistent pattern is from the very beginning. This is Jack Ruby's business manager, and he's also the guy who got Jack Ruby in 1967 on his deathbed. He went to record him and basically persuaded Ruby to say there was no conspiracy. He wanted to get that on tape. He put out a record to show it. Now, how come this person who has already had a career from 63 to 67 of arguing against any critic of the Warren Commission, how come he becomes the person who tells the story of Susan Atkins' confession to the world through these two mafia-linked lawyers, Caballero and Caruso? If that isn't suspicious, furthermore, as you said briefly, and I can't get into all of it, with Norman Mailer, as you know, and maybe your listeners know, Norman Mailer was an ardent believer that there was a conspiracy against Kennedy and that Oswald was not the sole assassin. Then he comes out with this book, Oswald's Tale, who commissioned that book to be written, who paid for it to be written, who supplied the research for it? Lawrence Schiller. So Lawrence Schiller basically paid Norman Mailer to recant his anti-Warren Commission beliefs and print a book that basically concludes Oswald acted alone, basically underscored the lone nut theory. So, you can put the pieces there. To me, that's extremely suspicious pattern of behavior.
Is it possible that his work is being sponsored in some kind of a nefarious way?
I can't prove it, but I believe it absolutely, and I'm happy to go on record to say it. It doesn't make any sense to me that this guy, he's like the Zelig of murder, mayhem, and assassination, who happens to be there every time one of these things happens. He gets Ruby's admission that no, there was no conspiracy. He's there to get Susan Atkins describing what supposedly happened in these murders. I've given you just a general idea of his history, and that, to me, is the mysterious and sinister part of this case. It's got nothing to do with brainwashed hippies or diabolical cult. It has to do with in what way is this shadow government of the United States and its media enablers putting across a grand narrative about all of these violent events that marked the 60s, all of them. Furthermore, a final thing I want to add, just to clarify how deeply fictional the story that you believe, I don't mean you, but the public, about this case. Jerry Cohen, an even more obscure person, was a journalist for the LA Times. He's who broke the story about the Manson murderers, and he's the first person who wrote about them as a savage, diabolical hippie cult who believed their leader was Jesus and who murdered people for some bizarre ideology. Jerry Cohen was a very good friend and business associate of Lawrence Schiller. Jerry Cohen was also involved as the FBI informant in the Garrison case, trying to disprove that there was any conspiracy. So there you have another figure. And Jerry Cohen also is responsible for writing this book, The Killing of Sharon Tate, that was widely distributed to the media so that even the murderers could get an idea, what is the cover story we're supposed to tell? And that was the basis of it. So this journalist, Jerry Cohen, should be looked into as well. He killed himself a few years ago, but he and Schiller worked together on the fringes of many of these controversies. So that is also very suspicious. Then we get into Bugliosi himself. Now, I'm sure most of your particular listeners know of his, gigantic book that he worked on for 20 years, Reclaiming History, which is an ironic name. Okay, so Bugliosi spent 20 years of his life trying to disprove that the mafia or the CIA or anyone but a lone nut named Lee Harvey Oswald was involved with the murder of Kennedy. He also did this ridiculous televised broadcast, which you may be familiar with, in 1986, where and this shows the theatrical nature of the whole phenomenon we're dealing with. He did a TV show where he pretended to be the prosecutor of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he, of course, wins the case. In the light of his supposed heroic victory in the Manson case, he then also proved that Lee Harvey Oswald was responsible.
Well, in that mock trial, I could say, and most assassination researchers think, that Jerry Spence was not exactly the man to put on that defense.
Well, of course, but the same could be said in the real Manson trial, which really was also an organized media event more than a real trial. Irving Kanarak, a name nobody remembers, was Manson's lawyer, and he did a horrifically bad job, almost a seemingly deliberately bad job of failing as any kind of defense attorney. So that ties in with that too. But if people think this is all conspiracy theory and nonsense, I want them to consider just one fact, which you may be aware of, is before Bugliosi began to do the research to do this bizarre televised trial of Lee Harvey Oswald, in which he pretended to be Lee Harvey Oswald's prosecuting attorney, he was in contact with David Atlee Phillips, well-known CIA officer who I'm sure your listeners are very aware of his murky career, but in case there's anyone who doesn't, David Atlee Phillips was a high-ranking CIA officer who I believe, and many other researchers believe, was operated in the CIA covertly as Maurice Bishop, and in that capacity was the handler and eventual framer of Lee Harvey Oswald. And, you know, many thousands of JFK assassination researchers have amassed a great deal of evidence, including the children of H. Howard Hunt, who said that Hunt himself admitted that David Atlee Phillips was deeply involved in the JFK assassination. You're surely aware of all that.
Have you heard that E. Howard Hunt recording? It's actually pretty striking.
Right, I have, yes. I mean, it's easy to digress from one controversy to the next, but to try to stay focused on the Manson thing, but it's what I'm talking about is it's the same story. JFK cover-up, Manson cover-up, it's the same personnel covering up the true nature of two murders. I'll leave it to your audience to try to figure out why they would have a motive to do that. But to me, a huge smoking gun in giving us an idea of who was Vincent Bugliosi, who was he working for, and why. Because, yes, he was an egotistical, arrogant self-promoter and hustler like Lawrence Schiller, but he had reasons to do what he was doing. And this connection, this was found in the Library of Congress, that he was in touch by letter with David Atlee Phillips, a person directly, in my mind and many others, connected to Lee Harvey Oswald and one of the principal architects of the assassination and of the consequent cover-up of the assassination, was in friendly contact with Bugliosi, and there is a letter, which I'm reprinting in my book, in which basically David Atlee Phillips, a CIA officer, is telling Bugliosi how to continue the cover-up. He's basically telling him, you know, you've got to do something to stop these conspiracy theorists, as he calls them, who are doubting the official story. And that, after this contact and this letter, which you may have seen, it ends with David Atlee Phillips saying, you know, okay, I look forward to meeting you in London, or something to that effect. So we have one little piece of evidence to prove that that Bugliosi and Phillips knew each other. If that isn't damning evidence of the complete lack of objectivity of Bugliosi's cover-up, I don't know what else could be.
Nikolas, I want to ask about communicating with Manson and the girls today. What is Charles Manson like in 2017? Can outsiders write him? What are the chances he'll even read it or respond? Are we able to write the girls? And I ask all these things because listeners really seem to want to know if they can correspond.
Well, I haven't had any contact with any of the women for decades, only when I first began researching the case, because I quickly found they're only going to stick to the cover story. And on a human level, I can't blame them. They are holding on to a very flimsy, wishful thinking hope that they can ever be paroled, which I don't believe they can be, but they need to keep repeating this story that they tell to the parole board. So nothing is to be gained by, from my point of view, in trying to determine the truth by speaking to them anymore. Manson he's 83 years old. He's not in the best of health. But he still occasionally answers letters. He calls people regularly. Since I've moved to Germany, it's much more difficult to communicate with him. And I haven't made any secret of this, but the only way you can communicate with American prisoners are not allowed to call overseas. It's actually illegal. But he has done that through third parties. He will call me, he'll call someone he knows, and that person will put a call through. So that's how we've communicated since I've moved to Austria and then to Germany. And Manson being Manson, has managed to frequently acquire cell phones in his cell. No pun intended, cell phone, but literally so in his case. And we've had very long and detailed conversations when he's been able to talk to me without guards or fellow prisoners overhearing him. And an important thing to say about that is the person who I've spoken to in these more intimate cell phone calls, and many other people who've had this experience can attest to this, he's an incredibly different person when you're talking to him without the camera on and when he knows that his call is not being listened to. As far as answering what is Manson like, the Manson you know from the media reports and the interviews he's done over the years is a performance for the most part. It's a character he plays, in dripping bloody letters called Charles Manson. It doesn't have a great deal to do with the much more thoughtful and complex person that presents himself when you have a chance to speak to him under different circumstances. That's a kind of performance he does, and that has to be understood. The person you think you know is not exactly the real person.
So let's talk about that question of parole.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested to know who you would support being paroled and whose potential parole you would not support.
Well, I have to point out there's a spiritual perspective to my answer there, in that I'm a Buddhist, so therefore I don't believe in the death penalty for even the most heinous of crimes. I don't believe that people should be killed because they killed. So that's the first thing. So I don't believe in the death penalty under any circumstances for anyone. As far as parole, I don't believe Manson ordered these murders. I don't believe he is the mastermind of these murders. I believe he was an accessory to these murders. He's guilty of being an accessory to these crimes. He was not the instigator of the crimes. I believe at 83 years old, he's not a nice person. I wouldn't trust him with the keys to your car or your purse. But is he a serial killing murderer? No, never was. And I don't think at 83 years old, Charles Manson is a danger. I do believe he's a criminal, and I know he's still deeply connected to the underworld, and that even in prison, he manages to pull off criminal enterprises that would amaze people, and even at his age, and even in his condition. But is he a murderous threat to society at this point? No. So, and I did in the 80s actively work to try to get him a retrial, and he participated in that even as recently as 2008. So, but I don't believe he wants to get out. I have to add that. I think after all the years I've known him, and even these sort of frustrating efforts to help him to gain some legal redress for what I believe is an injustice, I don't think he actually wants to get out. And I'm not sure that he ever did, really, though he made several escape attempts. I don't think he actually wanted to, and I can't fully explain that, but that's the case. With Charles Watson, I believe he was the instigator of these murders. I think he should remain in prison. I don't think he's a homicidal maniac because he killed for money. He killed for drugs. He was killing for the usual reasons that criminals kill. I don't think he's a particularly dangerous person. It's not like what people would think, that he's a psychopathic murderer who would suddenly start killing random strangers. But he's lied about what happened for 48 years. He's supposed to be a Christian preacher. He's even doubly hypocritical in that he has never admitted he is the responsible party for these crimes. He takes blame for having done the actual murders, but he continues to push the idea that he was a brainwashed innocent who was caught up in the evil Manson's mind control. And his deep involvement in the drug dealing network and criminal underworld of Los Angeles, there's no doubt about it. And I believe he should remain in prison for what he did. He did it on his own volition, and he should serve a life sentence. I absolutely believe that. Leslie Van Houten is the one who's most often touted as that she should be allowed out. I don't really have a firm decision about the women. Susan Atkins, I don't think she actually was very deeply involved in the crime. She bragged a lot and she told a lot of fantastic stories. She was certainly an unstable person, but I think she became more stable when she was off of the huge amount of drugs she was taking, and I don't really think she was a danger to society even by the mid-70s, from what I gathered. Krenwinkel, I don't think, is any kind of current danger to society, though, as I said, she did the majority of the killing and butchery that Tex Watson didn't do. I don't think she's any kind of threat to anything. On a moral basis, whether she should continue to serve her life sentence is another issue. I don't know exactly what good that does. She seems to be rehabilitated, whatever that means. But I think it's a difficult decision. She certainly deliberately murdered those people. So if you believe the death sentence should not be commuted from life, then, that's a very difficult question to answer. Kasabian, who is not in prison, I believe should be in prison. And I think Vincent Bugliosi and all of her co-defendants and everyone else involved in that case. And I have to add, many Hollywood celebrities and music people who met her and knew her and the others, they know she's not innocent. She was not the innocent, just going along for the ride angel that she's been presented as. She should definitely be serving time, in my opinion.
It seems like the Hollywood scandal of the day is another one that's been hidden for decades, and that's that of Harvey Weinstein. Now, you've been asked about this quite a bit. So what are your thoughts? Do you see any parallels regarding the secrecy of the Hollywood establishment here?
Well, actually, that's come up quite a lot recently. People have asked me through my Facebook page and through my representative, have sent questions that I've wanted to even perhaps write an essay about, because I think that's a very significant question you're asking. A lot of skeptics, and of course there are many, because if there's been any brainwashing in this case, it's not Manson brainwashing his followers, but the media brainwashing their own willing victims. They find it hard to believe. How could these well-known murders have been misreported and misrepresented so grotesquely? If what I'm saying is true, how could the media have got it wrong for so many decades? Well, I think exactly as you're saying, the Harvey Weinstein case, and it may well even lead to a break in this case. I actually believe that's a dim possibility. Why? Because what happened in 1969 was, if the case had been presented, if the murders and the crimes and the underworld background of the drug dealing and the sexual behavior of the people who were killed and of the people who killed them, if it had been revealed, and I get into this in great detail in my book, it would have shown that the Hollywood film and music industry was deeply connected to the criminal underworld, to drug dealing, to pornography, to many other felonies. And I'm not judging it morally, but if you can look at Harvey Weinstein and understand that the media knew these things were happening, many people reported it to them. Recently, Ronan Farrow, who is the son of Mia Farrow, a very good friend of Sharon Tate, who I also believe, if she were to be honest, knew a great deal about what the true nature of these murders were, though I'm sure she would deny it now. It's an interesting coincidence. Ronan Farrow, her son, tried to tell NBC about the nefarious rapist and sexual abuse activity of Harvey Weinstein, and they killed the story. And many other people tried to get the media to report on this for decades, and they didn't. And as you said, there's a deep connection to how the Manson case was misreported. If in 2017, only now is the media, and I believe the media are the enablers of powerful abusers in the film industry because they're dependent on them for their survival. You know, they work hand in hand with each other, so of course they cover up each other's lies and crimes. In 1969, when Los Angeles was even more corrupt, when the film industry was totally in the hands of the mafia, and we know through figures like Robert Evans, who was Roman Polanski's close friend, and who was later involved with the Cotton Club murders, who was proven to be a cocaine dealer, but at the time was the head of Paramount Studios. and a figure equally as powerful as Weinstein later became. The media protected him, and basically the Los Angeles film industry and music industry was protected by their media enablers to cover up the sexual peccadillos and the drug dealing and the drug abuse that was going on at the highest levels of Hollywood and the connections to the criminal underworld. It wasn't to scapegoat the hippie movement particularly. That was collateral damage. But I think if you can look at this case now and see how all of these very well-known people are admitting that they evaded the truth, that they lied to protect their careers, is it really so hard to imagine that in 1969 some of the major figures in Hollywood, in the rock industry, and in the film industry deliberately evaded the truth and lied, and that the media cooperated to cover up their deep knowledge of what really happened in these infamous murders? And the thing is, like the Weinstein thing, and I believe it's going to keep going deeper and deeper, were there to have been a trial that was a real trial and not just this coached and manufactured show trial in the Manson case, the film industry would have been destroyed by what would have been revealed about its true nature then in 1969. And Manson has often said this to me in so many words, many, many times, and for many years, that what was covered up was not who killed these people, but the relations between the people and what it would have revealed about their actual lives. So it's basically just, you've been lied to for 48 years to protect the reputations of powerful film and music industry people. And the aging survivors of that group of people have been lying for decades. And I could name them, but you can figure out pretty easily who were the friends of Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring. And in my book, I get pretty clearly into the details of what the nature of this cover-up and what these lies were. But retro-engineer it, I would say to the skeptical listener, if Weinstein's crimes could have been covered up, and look at Roman Polanski, recently charged again by a German actress just last week for a rape that was committed, she claims, many years ago. How many more crimes will he not ever be held to account for? A lot of things have come out about Hugh Hefner's life. The minute he died, as soon as he was cold, a lot of women started revealing the amount of hidden abuse. And there's even a connection with Hugh Hefner and his lieutenant Victor Lowndes to the Manson murder, which I get into in my book. So I think that's a good, not a metaphor, but it's really the same story. Ever since the 1920s, Hollywood and the media have been working to cover up their own depravity, their own criminal actions, and the public has largely gone along with it. This may be a turning point, the Weinstein case, but I have a feeling America, being the amnesiac nation it is, it will probably be distracted by some other event reasonably soon. But gives you a good idea of what went on in 1969 when there was no internet, when there was no way for people to reveal what the lies were. The media went along with it, they didn't report it properly, and 48 years later, we have a litany of lies that has become the facts about the Manson case.
Nikolas Schreck, author of The Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman. Now, if anybody out there wants to get a hold of you or wants to read more, how can they do so?
Right. They can reach me through my official Facebook page, Nikolas Schreck Official, my website, NikolasSchreck.eu, and my Instagram account, so there's ample ways to reach me. And the publication date of the next Manson File will probably be sometime in late November or December. I'm still working on it, and still, even at this day, new information and important parts of the puzzle come to me. So the last edition came out in 2011. There will be a significant amount of new material in this, and I'm hoping that it will come out by the end of this year. So you can reach me through all those various social media platforms.
If you'd like to hear even more, I would highly recommend the newest version of the Manson File when it is released. And for those who are spelling challenged, Nikolas Schreck is spelled Niklasschreck, NikolasSchreck. So, Nikolas, thanks for being on the show tonight.
It's been my pleasure, and the final thing I can say is what we've discussed, as I think you know, even though it's been lengthy, is really the tip of a very deep iceberg, and it's not as if your listeners, if they're intelligent, can put two and two together and follow up on some of the more obscure names which I've mentioned and do their own research, and I think they will be pretty startled by the fact that a lot of this mystery is out there in plain view, but it simply hasn't been put together in a coherent manner, and it's simply too complicated for the general public to even grasp just how complicated the mystery and the cover-up is. So thank you again for the time, and I appreciate your thoughtful questions.
Have a great night, Nikolas. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, we'll speak soon. Thank you.
I'm St. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back. He's the godfather of reality television, and now he has taken the reality of the JFK assassination straight to the establishment media in part 2 of the Jim Garrison tapes. John Barber is a pioneer, a conversationalist, a storyteller, and a friend of truth seekers worldwide.
Hi, this is John Barber, writer-director of the American Media and the second assassination of President John F. Kennedy. If you want to know how I continue to challenge the media elites in the name of Jim Garrison's legacy, listen to episode 10 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
I want to thank Nikolas Schreck for spending 3 great hours with us, and I want to end tonight a little differently than we normally do. When you think of the Manson case, many of you will still think of the helter-skelter myth and all it entails. It's a story more one-sided than Oswald acting alone or Marilyn Monroe dying of an accidental overdose. You will often hear alternatives to those mainstream theories, but when you see Charles Manson either in film or documentary, there is little to no chance that you will see or hear an alternative, except for here on the Midnight Rider News Show. We made a promise to you to bring you alternative theories on mainstream history, and tonight we have done just that. So we're going to leave you tonight with the song My World by Charles Manson. So from the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
My world is a sad world. Often wondered if there's blame. Such a fool in a mad, mad world, with no pictures in my frame. Everyone says crazy fool, you're always gazing at the night. With my arms around the tree, loving life with all my might. Crazy as I may seem, not knowing what to do, living with one crazy dream in a frantic world of blue. I awake every evening and somehow stumble through the night. Such a fool in a mad world, loving life with all my might. My world is a sad world, often wondered if there's blame. Such a fool in a mad, mad world, with no pictures in my frame. Loving you without a name.